was waiting. "Dear Alma," it began. "Greetings. I am very happy for your welcome." He was almost 13, 5 months older than I. His English was better than Tatiana's because he'd memorized the lyrics of almost all the Beatles songs. He sang them while accompanying himself on the accordion his grandfather gave him, the one who'd moved in after Misha's grandmother died, and, according to Misha, her soul descended on the Summers Gardens in St. Petersburg in the form of a flock of geese. It stayed for 2 weeks straight, honking in the rain, and when it left, the grass was covered with turds. His grandfather arrived a few weeks later, dragging behind him a battered suitcase filled with the 18 volumes of The History of the Jews. I gotta go turn my dang grandma's phone off. No, I'll just hope it doesn't go off more. He moved into the already cramped room Misha shared with his older sister. Svetlana took out his accordion and began to produce his life's work. At first, he just wrote variations on Russian folk songs mixed with Jewish riffs. Later, he moved on to darker, wilder versions, and at the very end, he stopped playing things they recognized altogether, and as he held the long notes, he wept, and no one needed to tell Misha and Svetya, even thick-headed as they were, that at last he'd become the composer he'd always wanted to be. He had a beat-up car that sat in the alley behind their apartment. The way Misha tells it, he drove like a blind man, giving the car almost full independence to feel its way along, bumping off things, only giving the wheel a spin with the tips of his fingers when the situation verged on life-threatening. When their grandfather came to pick them up from school, Misha and Svetlana would shield their ears and try to look away. When he revved the motor and became impossible to ignore, they'd hurry toward the car with their heads down and slide into the back seat. They'd huddle together in the back while their grandfather sat at the wheel, humming along to a tape of their cousin Lev's punk band. Pussy ass motherfucker. But he always got the words wrong. 4. Got into a fight, smashed his face on the car door. He might sing, "You are my knight and wear shining armor." And 4. "You're a louse, but you're so pretty," he'd sing. "Take it up to the house in a jitney." When Misha and his sister pointed out his mistakes, their grandfather acted surprised and turned up the volume to hear better, but the next time around he'd sing the same thing. When he died, he left Svetya the 18 volumes of the History of the Jews, and Misha the accordion. Around the same time, Lev's sister, who wore blue eyeshadow, invited Misha into her room, played him Let It Be, and taught him how to kiss. Number 7. The Boy with the Accordion. Misha and I wrote 21 letters back and forth. This was the year I was 12, 2 years before Jacob Marcus wrote to my mother asking her to translate the history of love. Misha's letters were filled with exclamation points and questions like, "What does mean your ass is grassy?" And mine were filled with questions about life in Russia. Then he invited me to his bar mitzvah party. My mother braided my hair, lent me her red shawl, and drove me to his apartment house in Brighton Beach. I rang the buzzer and waited for Misha to come down. My mother waved to me from the car. I shivered in the cold. A tall boy with dark fuzz on his upper lip came out. "Alma?" he asked. I nodded. "Welcome, my friend," he said. I waved to my mother and followed him inside. The lobby smelled like sour cabbage. Upstairs, the apartment was packed with people eating and shouting in Russian. There was a band set up in a corner of the dining room, and people kept trying to dance even though there was no room. Misha was busy talking to everyone and stuffing envelopes in his pocket, so I spent most of the party sitting in the corner of the couch with a plate of giant shrimp. I don't even eat shrimp, but it's the only thing I recognized. If anyone talked to me, I had to explain that I didn't speak Russian. An old man offered me some vodka. Just then, Misha rushed out of the kitchen strapped into his accordion, which was plugged into an amplifier, and broke into song. "You say it's your birthday," he shouted. The crowd looked nervous. "Well, it's my birthday too," he yelled, and the accordion shrieked to life. This led into Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which led into Here Comes the Sun, and eventually, after cozy apartment, down the hall, up 5 flights of stairs, through a door, and out onto the roof. You could see the ocean in the distance, the lights of Coney Island, and after that, an abandoned roller coaster. My teeth started to chatter, and Misha took off his jacket and put it around my shoulders. It was warm and smelled of sweat. Number 8. This is a Russian word that I do not know. Hi, this is Raven speaking. I don't know this word. It looks like barab, but it's in Russian letters, so I don't know. I told Misha everything about how my father had died and my mother's loneliness and Bert's unshakable belief in God. I told him about the 3 volumes of How to Survive in the Wild, and the English editor and his regatta, and Henry Lavender and his Philippine shells, and the vegetarian Tucci. I told him about Dr. Elridge and the life as we don't know it, and later, 2 years after we started to write to each other, 7 years after my dad died, and 3.9 billion years after the first life on Earth, when Jacob Marcus's first letter arrived from Venice. I told Misha about the history of love. Mostly we wrote or talked on the phone, but sometimes on the weekends we get to see each other. I liked going to Brighton Beach better because Mrs. Schlovsky would bring us tea with sweet cherries in china cups. And Mr. Schlovsky, whose armpits always had dark circles of sweat, taught me how to curse in Russian. Sometimes we'd rent movies, especially spy stories or thrillers. Our favorites were Rear Window, Strangers on a Train, and North by Northwest, which we'd watched 10 times. When I wrote to Jacob Marcus pretending to be my mother, it was Misha I told about it, reading the final draft to him over the phone. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think your ass is. Forget it," I said. Number 9. The Man Who Searched for a Stone. A week went by after I sent my letter, or my mother's letter, or whatever you want to call it. Another week went by, and I wondered if maybe Jacob Marcus was out of the country, possibly Cairo, or maybe Tokyo. A week went by, and I thought maybe he'd somehow figured out the truth. 4 days went by, and I studied my mother's face for signs of anger. It was already the end of July. A day went by, and I thought maybe I should write to Jacob Marcus and apologize. The next day, his letter came. My mother's name, Charlotte Singer, was written across the front in fountain pen. I slipped it into the waist of my shorts just as the telephone rang. "Hello," I said impatiently. "Is the Messiah home?" said the voice on the other end. "Who?" "The Messiah," the kid said, and I heard muffled laughter in the background. It sounded a little like Louis, who lived 1 block over and used to be Bert's friend until he met other friends he liked better and stopped talking to Bert. "Leave him alone," I said, and hung up, wishing I'd thought of something better. I ran up the block to the park, holding my side so the envelope wouldn't slip. It was hot out, and I was already sweating. I tore the letter open next to a trash can in Long Meadow. The first page was about how much Jacob Marcus liked the chapters my mother had sent. I skimmed it until, on the second page, I got to the sentence that read, "I still haven't mentioned your letter." He wrote, "I'm flattered by your curiosity. I wish I had more interesting answers to all your questions. I have to say, these days I spend a lot of time just sitting here and looking out the window. I used to love to travel, but the trip to Venice was harder than I thought, and I doubt I'll do it again. My life, for reasons beyond my control, has been pared down to the simplest elements. For example, here on my desk is a stone. A dark gray piece of granite cut in half by a vein of white. It took me most of the morning to find it. Many stones were rejected first. I didn't set out with a particular idea of the stone in my mind. I thought I'd recognize it when I found it. As I searched, I developed certain requirements. It had to fit comfortably in the palm, be smooth, preferably gray, etc. So that was my morning. I've spent the last few hours recovering. It wasn't always like this. It used to be that a day was worthless to me if I hadn't produced a certain amount of work. That I noticed or didn't notice the gardener's limp, the ice on the lake, the long, solemn outings of my neighbor's child who appears to have no friends. These things were beside the point. What's changed now? You asked me if I was married. I was once, but that was a long time ago, and we were clever or stupid enough not to have a child. Before I read this next part, for some reason I have it underlined, which means way back when I got this book, I underlined it, which means, I don't know, it meant something to me. We met each other when we were young, before we knew enough about disappointment, and once we did, we found we reminded each other of it. I guess you could say, that was all I had underlined, by the way. I guess you could say that I wear a little Russian astronaut on my lapel, too. I live alone now, which doesn't bother me, or maybe just a little, but it would take an unusual woman to want to keep me company now that I can hardly walk down to the bottom of the driveway and back to pick up the mail. I still do it, though. Twice a week, a friend brings by some groceries, and my neighbor looks in once a day with the excuse of wanting to check on the strawberries she planted in my garden. I don't even like strawberries. I'm making it sound worse than it is. I don't even know you yet, and I'm already fishing for sympathy. You also asked what I do. I read. This morning I finished The Street of Crocodiles for the third time. I found it almost unbearably beautiful. Also, I watch movies. My brother got me a DVD player. You wouldn't believe how many movies I've watched in the last month. That's what I do. Watch movies and read. Sometimes I even pretend to write, but I'm not fooling anyone. Oh, and I go to the mailbox. Enough. I loved your book. Please send me some more. J.M. Number 10. I read the letter 100 times, and each time I read it, I felt I knew a little less about Jacob Marcus. He said he spent the morning looking for a rock, but he never said anything more about why the history of love was so important to him. Of course, it didn't escape me that he'd written, I don't even know you yet. Yet! Meaning he was expecting to get to know us better, or at least our mother, since he didn't know about Bert and me. Yet. But why? Why could he hardly walk to the mailbox and back? And why would it take an unusual woman to keep him company? And why was he wearing a Russian astronaut on his lapel? I decided to make a list of clues. I went home, closed my bedroom door, and took out the third volume of How to Survive in the Wild. I turned to a new page. I decided to write everything in code, in case anyone decided to snoop around my things. I remembered Saint X. At the top I wrote, How to survive if your parachute fails to open. Then I wrote, search for a stone, live near a lake, have a gardener with a limp, read The Street of Crocodiles, need an unusual woman, have trouble just walking to the mailbox. Those were all the clues I could come up with from his letter, so I snuck into my mother's study while she was downstairs and got his other letters out of her desk drawer. I read these for more clues. That's when I remembered that his first letter began with a quote from my mother's introduction about Nicanor Para, the one about how he wore a little Russian astronaut on his lapel and carried in his pockets the letters of a woman who left him for another. When Jacob Marcus wrote that he also wore a Russian astronaut, did it mean that his wife had left him for someone else? Because I wasn't sure. I didn't put this down as a clue. Instead, I wrote, take a trip to Venice. A long time ago, have someone read to you the history of love while you're falling asleep. Never forget it. I looked over my clues. None of them helped. Number 11. How I am. I decided that I really wanted to find out who Jacob Marcus was and why it was so important to him to have the book translated. The only place left to look was the history of love. I snuck upstairs to my mother's study to see if I could print the chapter she translated off her computer. The only problem was that she was sitting in front of it. Hello, she said. Hello, I said, trying to sound casual. How are you, she said. Fine, thank you, how are you? I answered, because that's what she taught me to say, as well as how to hold my knife and fork properly, how to balance a teacup between two fingers, and the best way to take out a piece of food between my teeth without drawing attention to myself, on the off chance that the Queen happened to invite me for high tea. When I pointed out and said she was trying to be a good mother, and if she didn't teach me, who would? I wish she hadn't, though, because sometimes being polite is worse than being not polite. Like the time Greg Feldman passed me in the hall at school and said, "Hey Alma, what's up?" And I said, "Fine, thank you, how are you?" And he stopped and gave me a look like I'd just parachuted down from Mars, and said, "Why can't you ever just say, 'Not much'?" Number 12, not much. It got dark out, and my mother said there was nothing to eat in the house, and did we want to order some Thai food, or maybe West Indian, or how about Cambodian? "Why can't we cook?" I asked. "Macaroni and cheese," my mother asked. "Mrs. Slavsky makes a very good chicken la orange," I said. My mother looked doubtful. "Chili," I said. While she was at the supermarket, I went up to her study and printed out chapters 1 through 15 of the History of Love, which was as far as she'd gotten. I took the pages downstairs and hid them in my survival backpack under the bed. A few minutes later, my mother came home with 1 pound of ground turkey, 1 head of broccoli, 3 apples, a jar of pickles, and a box of marzipan imported from Spain. Number 13. The eternal disappointment of life as it is. After a dinner of microwaved fake meat chicken nuggets, I went to bed early and read what my mother had translated of the History of Love under the covers by flashlight. There was the chapter about how people used to talk with their hands, and the chapter about the man who thought he was made of glass, and a chapter I hadn't read called The Birth of Feeling. Feelings are not as old as time, it begins. So, for some reason, my younger self also put a star next to this. I'm really sensitive right now, so I'm gonna get emotional. I can already tell. Just as there was a first instant when someone rubbed 2 sticks together to make a spark, there was a first time joy was felt, and a first time for sadness. For a while, new feelings were being invented all the time. Desire was born early, as was regret. When stubbornness was felt for the first time, it started a chain reaction, creating the feeling of resentment on the one hand, and alienation and loneliness on the other. It might have been a certain counterclockwise movement of the hips that marked the birth of ecstasy, a bolt of lightning that caused the first feeling of awe, or maybe it was the body of a girl named Alma. Contrary to logic, the feeling of surprise wasn't born immediately. It only came after people had enough time to get used to things as they were. And when enough time had passed, and someone felt the first feelings of surprise, someone, somewhere else, felt the first pang of nostalgia. It's also true that sometimes people felt things and, because there was no word for them, they were unmentioned. The oldest emotion in the world may be that of being moved, but to describe it, just to name it, must have been like trying to catch something invisible. Then again, the oldest feeling in the world might simply have been confusion. Having begun to feel, people's desire to feel grew. They wanted to feel more, feel deeper, despite how much it sometimes hurt. People became addicted to feeling. They struggled to uncover new emotions. It's possible that this is how art was born. New kinds of joy were forged, along with new kinds of sadness. The eternal disappointment of life as it is, the relief of unexpected reprieve, the fear of dying. Even now, all possible feelings do not yet exist. There are still those that lie beyond our capacity and our imagination. From time to time, when a piece of music no one has ever written, or a painting no one has ever painted, or something else impossible to predict, fathom, or yet describe takes place, a new feeling enters the world, and then, for the millionth time in the history of feeling, the heart surges and absorbs the impact. All of the chapters were sort of like this, and none of them really told me anything about why the book was so important to Jacob Marcus. Instead, I found myself thinking about my father, about how much the History of Love must have meant to him if he gave it to my mother only 2 weeks after they met, even though he knew she couldn't read Spanish yet. Why? Because he was falling in love with her, of course. Then I thought of something else. What if my father had written something inside the copy of the History of Love he gave to my mother? It had never occurred to me to look, I got out of bed and went upstairs. Mom's study was empty and the book was next to her computer. I lifted it up and opened to the title page. In handwriting I didn't recognize, it said, "For Charlotte, my Alma. This is the book I would have written for you if I could write. Love, David." I went back to bed and thought about my father and those 20 words for a long time. And then I started to think about her, Alma. Who was she? My mother would say she was everyone. Every girl and every woman that anyone ever loved. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought that she also must have been someone. Because how could Litvinov have written so much about love without being in love himself with someone in particular? And that someone must have been named. Under the 9 clues I've already written, I added one more. Alma. I'm having a really hard time reading this, but I'm going to try to finish for you guys because there's just a little bit left to this chapter. Number 14, The Birth of Feeling. I raced down to the kitchen, but it was empty. Outside the window, in the middle of our backyard, overgrown and full of weeds, was my mother. I pushed open the screen door. "Alma," I said, catching my breath. My mother said. She was holding a gardening trowel. I didn't have time to stop and think about why she was holding a gardening trowel, since it was my father who gardened, not her. And since it was already 9:30 at night. What was her last name? I asked. "What are you talking about?" my mother said. "Alma," I said impatiently. "The girl in the book. What's her last name?" My mother wiped her forehead, leaving a smear of dirt. Actually, now that you mention it, one of the chapters does mention a surname, but it's strange, because while all the other names in the book are Spanish, her surname is... My mother frowned. "What?" I said. "Maraminsky," my mother said, excited. "Maraminsky," I repeated. She nodded. "Maraminsky. Polish. It's one of the few clues Litvinov left about where he came from." I ran back upstairs, climbed into bed, turned on my flashlight, and opened the 3rd volume of How to Survive in the Wild. Next to Alma, I wrote, Maraminsky. The next day, I started to look for her. This is a new chapter. It's called The Trouble with Thinking. If Litvinov coughed more and more as the years passed, a hacking cough that shook his whole body, causing him to bend over double and made it necessary for him to excuse himself from dinner tables, refuse phone calls, and turn down the occasional invitation to speak. It wasn't so much because he was ill, as that there was something he wished to say. The more time passed, the more he longed to say it, and the more impossible saying it became. Sometimes he woke in a panic from his dreams. "Rosa," he'd shout. But before the words were out of his mouth, he'd feel her hand on his chest. And at the sound of her voice, "What is it? What's wrong, sweetheart?" He'd lose his courage, overcome with fear of the consequences. And so instead of saying what he wanted to say, he said, "It's nothing, just a bad dream," and waited for her to fall back asleep before pushing off the covers and stepping out to the balcony. When he was young, Litvinov had a friend. Not his best friend, but a good one. The last time he saw this friend was the day he left Poland. The friend was standing on a street corner. They'd already parted ways, but both turned back to see the other go. For a long time they stood there. His friend's cap was gathered in a fist held to his chest. He raised his hand, saluted Litvinov, and smiled. Then he pulled his cap down over his eyes, turned, and disappeared empty-handed into the crowd. Not a day went by now that Litvinov did not think about that moment or that friend. On nights when he couldn't sleep, Litvinov would sometimes go to his study and take out his copy of The History of Love. He reread the 14th chapter, The Age of String, so many times that now the binding opened to it automatically. This is a part that I also starred when I was in high school, so chapter 14 apparently I really liked. So many words get lost. They leave the mouth and lose their courage, wandering aimlessly until they are swept into the gutter like dead leaves. On rainy days, you can hear their chorus rushing past. I was a beautiful girl. Please don't go. I too believe my body is made of glass. I've never loved anyone. I think of myself as funny. Forgive me. There was a time when it wasn't uncommon to use a piece of string to guide words that otherwise might falter on the way to their destinations. Shy people carried a little bundle of string in their pockets, but people considered loudmouths had no less need for it, since those used to being overheard by everyone were often at a loss for how to make themselves heard by someone. The physical distance between two people using a string was often small. Sometimes the smaller the distance, the greater the need for the string. The practice of attaching cups to the ends of the string came much later. Some say it is related to the irrepressible urge to press shells to our ears, to hear the still surviving echo of the world's first expression. Others say it was started by a man who held the end of a string that was unraveled across the ocean by a girl who left for America. When the world grew bigger, and there wasn't enough string to keep the things people wanted to say from disappearing into the vastness, the telephone was invented. Sometimes no length of string is long enough to say the thing that needs to be said. In such cases, all the string can do, in whatever its form, is conduct a person's silence. And Lipmanov coughed. The printed book in his hands was a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of the original, which no longer existed except in his head. Not the original, as in the ideal book a writer imagines before sitting down to write. The original that existed in Litvinov's head was the memory of the manuscript handwritten in his mother's tongue, the one he'd held in his hands the day he'd said goodbye to his friend for the last time. They hadn't known it was going to be the last, but in their hearts, each had wondered. In those days, Litvinov had been a journalist. He'd worked at a daily, writing obituaries. From time to time, in the evenings after work, he went to a cafe populated by artists and philosophers. Because Litvinov didn't know many people there, he usually just ordered a drink and pretended to read a newspaper he'd already read, listening to the conversations around him. The thought of time outside of our experience is intolerable. Marx, my ass. The novel is dead. Before we declare our consent, we must carefully examine. Liberation is just the means of attaining freedom. It's not synonymous with it. Malevich, my snot is more interesting than that butthole. And that, my friend, is the trouble with thinking. Sometimes Litvinov found himself disagreeing with someone's argument, and in his head he delivered a brilliant rebuttal. One night he heard a voice behind him. Must be a good article. You've been reading it for the last half hour. Litvinov jumped, and when he looked up, the familiar face of his old childhood friend was smiling down at him. They embraced and took in the slight changes time had enacted on the other's appearance. Litvinov had always felt a certain affinity with this friend, and he was anxious to know what he'd been doing the last few years. Working like everyone else, his friend said, pulling up a chair. And you're writing? Litvinov asked. His friend shrugged. It's quiet at night. No one bothers me. The landlord's cat comes and sits on my lap. Usually I fall asleep at my desk and wake when the cat stalks off at the first sign of daylight. And then, for no reason, they both laughed. From then on, they met every evening at the cafe. With groaning horror, they discussed the movements of Hitler's armies and the rumored actions being taken against the Jews until they became too depressed to speak. But perhaps something more cheerful, his friend would finally say, and Litvinov would happily change the subject, eager to test out one of his philosophical theories on his old friend, or to run by him a new fast cash plan involving ladies' stockings and the black market, or to describe the pretty girl who lived across the street from him. His friend, in turn, occasionally showed Litvinov bits of what he was working on. Small things, a paragraph here and there. But Litvinov was always moved. With the first page he read, he recognized that, in the time since they had been schoolboys together, his friend had grown into a real writer. A few months later, when it was learned that Isaac Babel had been killed by Moscow's secret police, it fell to Litvinov to write the obituary. It was an important assignment, and he worked hard on it, trying to strike the right tone for a great writer's tragic death. He didn't leave the office until midnight, but as he walked home through the cold night, he smiled to himself, believing the obituary was one of his finest. So often the material he had to work with was thin and paltry, and he had to patch something together with a few superlatives, cliches, and false notes of glory in order to commemorate the life and bolster his sense of loss over the death. But not this time. This time it had been necessary to rise to the material, to struggle to find words for a man who had been a master of words, who had devoted his entire existence to resisting the cliché in the hope of introducing to the world a new way of thinking and writing, a new way even of feeling, and whose reward for his labors was death by firing squad. The next day it appeared in the newspaper. His editor called him into his office to congratulate him on his work. A few of his colleagues also complimented him. When he saw his friend that evening in the cafe, he too praised the piece. Litvinov ordered them a round of vodka, feeling happy and proud. A few weeks later, his friend didn't show up at the cafe as usual. Litvinov waited an hour and a half and then gave up and went home. The next evening, he waited again, and again his friend didn't come. Worried, Litvinov set out for the house where his friend boarded. He'd never been, but he knew the address. When he got there, he was surprised by how dingy and run down the house was, by the oily walls in the entryway and the smell of something stale. He knocked on the first door he came to. A woman answered. Litvinov asked after his friend. "Yeah, sure," she said. "The big writer," she jerked her thumb upwards. "Top floor on the right." Litvinov knocked for 5 minutes before he finally heard his friend's heavy steps on the other side. When the door opened, his friend stood in his bedclothes looking pale and haggard. "What happened?" Litvinov asked. His friend shrugged and coughed. "Watch out or you'll catch it too," he said, dragging himself back to bed. Litvinov stood awkwardly in his friend's cramped room, wanting to help, but not knowing how. At last a voice came from the pillows. "A cup of tea would be nice." Litvinov hurried to the corner where a makeshift kitchen was set up and banged around looking for the kettle. "On the stove," his friend called weakly. While the water boiled, he opened the window to let in a little fresh air and washed the dirty dishes. When he brought the steaming cup of tea to his friend, he saw that he was shivering with a fever, so he closed the window and went downstairs to ask the landlady for an extra blanket. Eventually his friend fell asleep. Not knowing what else to do, Litvinov sat down in the only chair in the room and waited. After a quarter of an hour, a cat meowed at the door. Litvinov let it in, but when she saw that her midnight companion was indisposed, she stalked out. In front of the chair was a wooden desk. Pages were scattered across the surface. One caught Litvinov's eye and, glancing over to make sure his friend was soundly asleep, he picked it up. Across the top it said, "The death of Isaac Babel." Only after they charged him with the crime of silence did Babel discover how many kinds of silences existed. When he heard music, he no longer listened to the notes, but the silences in between. When he read a book, he gave himself over entirely to the commas and semicolons, to the space after the period and before the capital letter of the next sentence. He discovered the places in a room where silence gathered, the folds of curtain drapes, the deep pulls of the family silver. When people spoke to him, he heard less and less of what they were saying, and more of what they were not. He learned to decipher the meaning of certain silences, which is like solving a tough case without any clues, with only intuition. And no one could accuse him of not being prolific in his chosen métier. I don't know that word. Daily, he turned out whole epics of silence. In the beginning, it had been difficult. Imagine the burden of keeping silent when your child asks you whether God exists, or the woman you love asks you if you love her back. At first, Babel longed for the use of just 2 words, yes and no. But he knew that just to utter a single word would be to destroy the delicate fluency of silence. Even after they arrested him and burnt all of his manuscripts, which were all blank pages, he refused to speak. Not even a groan when they gave him a blow to the head, a boot tip in the groin. Only at the last possible moment, as as he faced the firing squad, did the writer babble suddenly sense the possibility of his error. As the rifles were pointed at his chest, he wondered if what he had taken for the richness of silence was really the poverty of never being heard. He had thought the possibilities of human silence were endless, but as the bullets tore from the rifles, his body was riddled with the truth. And a small part of him laughed bitterly because, anyway, how could he have forgotten what he had always known? There's no match for the silence of God. Livanov dropped the page. He was furious. How could his friend, who could have his pick of what to write about, still the one subject about which he, Livanov, happened to have written something of which he was proud? He felt mocked and humiliated. He wanted to drag his friend out of bed and demand what he'd meant by it. But after a moment he cooled down and read it again. And as he did, he recognized the truth. His friend hadn't stolen anything that belonged to him. How could he have? A person's death belongs to no one but the one who's died. A feeling of sadness came over him. All these years, Livanov had imagined he was so much like his friend. He prided himself on what he considered their similarities. But the truth was that he was no more like the man fighting a fever in the bed 10 feet away than he was like the cat that had just slunk off. They were different species. It was obvious, Livanov thought. All you had to do was look at how each had approached the same subject. Where he saw a page of words, his friend saw the field of hesitations, black holes, and possibilities between the words. Where his friend saw dappled light, the felicity of flight, the sadness of gravity, he saw the solid form of a common sparrow. Livanov's life was defined by a delight in the weight of the real, his friend's by a rejection of reality, with its army of flat-footed facts. Looking at his reflection in the dark window, Livanov believed something had been peeled away and a truth revealed to him. He was an average man. A man willing to accept things as they were, and, because of this, he lacked the potential to be in any way original. And though he was wrong in every way about this, after that night, nothing could dissuade him. Beneath the death of Isaac Babel was another page, with tears of self-pity stinging his sinuses. Livanov read on. Franz Kafka is dead. He died in a tree from which he wouldn't come down. Come down, they cried to him. Come down, come down. Silence filled the night, and the night filled the silence while they waited for Kafka to speak. I can't, he finally said, with a note of wistfulness. Why? They cried. Stars spilled across the black sky. Because then you'll stop asking for me. The people whispered and nodded among themselves. They put their arms around each other and laughed and touched their children's hair. They took off their hats and raised them to the small, sickly man with the ears of a strange animal sitting in his black velvet suit in the dark tree. Then they turned and started for home under the canopy of leaves. Children were carried on their father's shoulders, sleepy from having been taken to see the man who wrote his books on pieces of bark. He tore off the tree from which he refused to come down, in his delicate, beautiful, illegible handwriting, and they admired those books, and they admired his will and stamina. After all, who doesn't wish to make a spectacle of his loneliness? One by one, families broke off with a good night and a squeeze of the hands, suddenly grateful for the company of neighbors. Doors closed to warm houses. Candles were lit in windows. Far off, in his perch in the trees, Kafka listened to it all, the rustle of clothes being dropped to the floor, of lips fluttering along naked shoulders, beds creaking under the weight of tenderness. It all caught in the delicate, pointed shells of his ears and rolled like pinballs through the great hall of his mind. That night, a freezing wind blew in. When the children woke up, they went to the windows and found the world encased in ice. One child, the smallest, shrieked out in delight, and her cry tore through the silence and exploded the ice of a giant oak tree. The world shone. They found him frozen on the ground like a bird. It said that when they put their ears to the shell of his ears, they could hear themselves. Beneath that page was another page, titled The Death of Tolstoy, and beneath that was one for Osip Mandelstam, who died at the bitter end of 1938 in a transit camp near Vladivostok. was breathing heavily. He started to read. When he got to the end, he shook his head and read it again, and again after that. He read it over and over, mouthing the words as if they were not an announcement of death, but a prayer for life. As if just by saying them, he could keep his friend safe from the angel of death, and force of his breath alone keeping its wings pinned for a moment more. A moment more. A moment more. Until it gave up and left his friend alone. All night, Litvinov watched over his friend, and all night he moved his lips, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he did not feel useless. As morning broke, Litvinov saw with relief that the color had returned to his friend's face. He was sleeping the restful sleep of recovery. When the sun had climbed to the position of 8 o'clock, he stood. His legs were stiff. His insides felt scraped out. But he was filled with happiness. He folded the death of Leopold Gursky in half. And here is another thing no one knows about Zvi Litvinov. For the rest of his life, he carried in his breast pocket the page he'd protected all night from becoming real, so that he could buy a little more time for his friend, for life. We're starting a new chapter now. This is called Until the Writing Hand Hurts. The pages I'd written so long ago slipped away, slipped from my hands and scattered to the floor. I thought, who and how? I thought, after all these, what years? I fell back into my memories. The night passed in a fog. By morning I was still shocked. It was noon before I was able to go on. I knelt down in the flower. I gathered the pages up one by one. Page 10 gave me a paper cut. Page 22 a pain in the kidneys. Page 4 a blockage in the heart. A bitter joke came to my mind. Words failed me. And yet, I clutched the pages, afraid my mind was playing tricks on me, that I would look down and find them blank. I made my way to the kitchen. The cake sagged on the table. Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered today to celebrate the mysteries of life. What? No. Stone throwing is not allowed. Only flowers or money. I wiped the eggshells and spilled sugar off my chair and sat down at the table. Outside, my loyal pigeon cooed and fluttered its wings against the glass. Perhaps I should have given him a name. Why not? I've taken pains to name plenty of things less real than he. I tried to think of a name that would give me pleasure to call. I glanced around. My eye came to rest on the menu from the Chinese takeout. They haven't changed it for years. Mr. Tong's famous Cantonese, Szechuan, and human cuisine. I tapped the window. The pigeon flapped off. Goodbye, Mr. Tong. It took me most of the afternoon to read. Memories crowded in. My eyes blurred. I had trouble focusing. I thought, I'm seeing things. I pushed back my chair and stood. I thought, Mazel tov, Gursky, you finally lost it completely. I watered the plant. To lose, you have to have had. Ah, so now you are a stickler for details. Have, didn't have. Listen to you. You made a profession out of losing. A champion loser you were. And yet, where's the proof you've ever had her? Where's the proof that she was yours to have? I filled the sink with soapy water and washed the dirty pots. And with each pot and pan and spoon I put away, I also put away a thought I couldn't bear, until my kitchen and my mind returned to a state of mutual organization. And yet, Shlomo Wasserman had become Ignacio da Silva. The character I called Doodle Slock was now Rodriguez. Feingold was Di Piedma. So-called synonym became Buenos Aires, a town I'd never heard of and now stood in for Minsk. It was almost funny, but I didn't laugh. I studied the handwriting on the envelope. There was no note. Believe me, I checked 5 or 6 times. No return address. I would have interrogated Bruno if I'd thought he'd have anything to tell. If there's a package, the super leaves it on the table in the lobby. No doubt Bruno saw it and picked it up. It's a big event when something comes for either of us that can't fit in the mailbox. If I'm not mistaken, the last time was 2 years ago. Bruno had ordered a studded dog collar. Perhaps it doesn't go without saying that he'd recently brought home a dog. It was small and warm and something to love. He called it BB. Come, BB, come. I'd hear him call, but BB never came. Then one day he took it to the dog run. Vamos, Chico, someone called to their dog, and Bibi took off toward the Puerto Rican. Come, Bibi, come! Bruno cried, but to no avail. He switched tactics. Vamos, Bibi, he shrieked at the top of his lungs. And lo and behold, Bibi came running. She barked all night and shat over the floor, but he loved her. One day Bruno took her to the dog run. She frolicked and shat and sniffled while Bruno looked on with pride. The gate opened for an Irish setter. Bibi glanced up. Before Bruno knew what was happening, she shot through the open gate and disappeared down the street. He tried to chase her. Run, he said to himself. The memory of speed flooded his system, but his body revolted. With his first steps, his leg tangled and wilted. Vamos, Bibi, he cried. And yet, no one came. In his hour of need, crumpled on the sidewalk while Bibi betrayed him by being what she was, an animal. I was at home pecking away at my typewriter. He came home, devastated. That evening we went back to the dog run to wait for her. She'll come back, I said. But she never came back. That was 2 years ago, and still he goes to wait. I tried to make sense of things. Now that I think about it, I have always tried. It could be my epitaph, Leo Gerksky. He tried to make sense. Night fell, and still I was lost. I hadn't eaten all day. I called Mr. Tong, the Chinese takeout, not the bird. 20 minutes later, I was alone with my spring rolls. I turned on the radio. They were asking for pledges. In return, you got a plunger that said WNYC. There are things I find hard to describe, and yet I persist like a stubborn mule in my efforts. Once Bruno came downstairs and saw me sitting at the kitchen table in front of my typewriter. That thing again. The earphones had slipped down to rest like a half halo on the back of his head. I kneaded my knuckles over the steam from my teacup. A regular Vladimir Horowitz, he remarked as he passed on his way to the refrigerator. He hunched over, digging around for whatever it was he wanted in there. I rolled a new page into my machine. He turned around. The refrigerator door is still open, a milk mustache on his upper lip. Play on, maestro, he said, then pulled the earphones onto his ears and shoveled out the door, turning on the light above the table as he passed. I watched the light chain swing as I listened to the voice of Molly Bloom blasting his ears. There's nothing like a kiss long and hot down to your soul almost paralyzes you. It's only her Bruno listens to now, wearing down the magnetic strip. Over and over, I read the pages of the book I'd written as a young man. It was so long ago. I was naive. A 20-year-old in love. A swollen heart and a head to match. I thought I could do anything. Strange as that might seem, now that I've done all I'm going to do. I thought, how did it survive? As far as I knew, the only copy was lost in a flood. I mean, if you don't count the excerpts I sent in letters to the girl I loved after she left for America. I couldn't resist sending her my best pages, but it was only a few parts, and here in my hands was almost the whole book. Somehow in English, with Spanish names. It boggled the mind. I sat Shiva for Isaac, and while I sat, I tried to understand. Alone in my apartment, the pages on my lap. Night became day, became night, became day. I fell in and out of sleep, but I didn't get any closer to solving the mystery. Story of my life. I was a locksmith. I could unlock every door in the city, and yet I couldn't unlock anything I wanted to unlock. I decided to make a list of all the people I knew or were alive in case I was forgetting someone. I busied myself looking for paper and pen. Then I sat down, smoothed down the page, and brought the nib to meet it. But my mind drew a blank. Instead I wrote, questions for the sender. This I underlined twice. I continued. 1. Who are you? 2. Where did you find this? 3. How did it survive? 4. Why is it in English? 5. Who else has read it? 6. Did they like it? And then he's crossed that out. And then rewritten. 6 is the number of readers granted songs. This is a game of concentration. The girls sing and clap. No repeats or hesitations. Starting with, I wait on tenter hooks. Animals, they shout. Animals, I think. Horse, one says. Monkey, says the other. Back and forth it goes. Cow, shouts the first. Tiger, cries the second, because a moment of hesitation ruins the rhythm and ends the game. Pony, kangaroo, mouse, lion, giraffe. One girl fumbles. Yak, I shout. I looked down at my page of questions. What would it take, I wondered, for a book I wrote 60 years ago to arrive in my mailbox in a different language? Suddenly, I was struck by a thought. It came to me in Yiddish. I'll do my best to paraphrase. It was something along the lines of, could I be famous without knowing it? I felt dizzy. I drank down a glass of cold water and took some aspirin. Don't be an idiot, I told myself. And yet, I grabbed my coat. The first drops of rain pelted the window, so I put on my galoshes. Bruno calls them rubbers, but that's his business. Outside, a howling wind. I struggled down the streets, locked in a battle with my umbrella. 3 times it blew itself inside out. I hung on. Once it slammed me against the side of a building. Twice I was airborne. I reached the library, my face lashed by rain. Water dripped from my nose. The beast my umbrella was shattered, so I discarded it in the stand. I made my way to the librarian's desk. Scamper, stop, and pant. Hike up trouser legs. Step, drag, etc. The librarian's chair was vacant. I quote-unquote hurried around the reading room. Finally, I found someone. She was re-shelving. I had difficulty restraining myself. I'd like Everything You Have by the writer Leo Gerksky, I shouted. She turned to look at me. So did everyone else. Excuse me. Everything You Have by the writer Leo Gerksky, I repeated. I'm in the middle of something. You'll have to wait a minute. I waited a minute. Leo Gerksky, I said. G-U-R. She shoved her card along. I know how to spell it. I followed her to the computer. She typed in my name. My heart raced. I may be old, but my heart can still get it up. There's a book about bullfighting by a Leonard Gerksky, she said. Not him, I said. What about a Leopold? Leopold, she said. Here it is. I clutched the nearest stable object. Drumroll, please. The incredible, fantastic adventures of Frankie, toothless girl wonder, she said, and grinned. I fought the urge to smack her over the head with my galosh. Off she went for the book in the children's section. I didn't stop her. Instead, I died a little death. She sat me down with it. Enjoy, she said. Once, Bruno said that if I bought a pigeon, halfway down the street it would become a dove. On the bus home, a parrot, and in my apartment, the moment before I took it out of the cage, a phoenix. That's you, he said, brushing some crumbs that weren't there from the table. A few minutes passed. No, it's not, I said. He shrugged and looked out the window. Whoever heard of a phoenix, I said. A peacock, maybe, but a phoenix, I don't think so. His face was turned away, but I thought I saw his mouth twitch in a smile. But now I couldn't do anything to turn the nothing the librarian had found into something. In the days after my heart attack, and before I began to write again, all I could think about was dying. I'd been spared again, and only after the danger had passed did I allow my thoughts to unravel to their inevitable end. I imagined all the ways I could go. Blood clot to the brain, infarction, thrombosis, pneumonia, grand mal abstraction to the vena cava. I saw myself foaming at the mouth, writhing on the floor. I'd wake up in the night, gripping my throat. And yet, no matter how often I imagined the possible failure of my organs, I found the consequence inconceivable. That it could happen to me, I forced myself to picture the last moments, the penultimate breath, a final sigh, and yet, it was always followed by another. I remember the first times I understood what it was to die. I was 9. My uncle, my father's brother, may his memory be a blessing, died in his sleep. There was no explanation. A huge, strapping man who ate like a horse and went out in the freezing cold to break blocks of ice with his bare hands. Behind my aunt's fascia. My brother and I slipped in to behold the great heap. The body was more remarkable to us in death than it had been in life. The forest of fur on the back of his hands, the flat yellowed nails, the thick rime on the soles of his feet. He seemed so human, and yet horribly not. Once I came in to bring my father a glass of tea. He was sitting with the body, which couldn't be left alone for even a minute. I have to go to the bathroom, he told me. Wait here until I come back. Before I could protest that I hadn't even been bar mitzvahed, he rushed out to relieve himself. The next few minutes passed like hours. My uncle was laid out on a slab of stone the color of raw meat with white veins. Once I thought I saw his chest rise a fraction and almost shrieked. But it wasn't only him I was afraid of. I was afraid for myself. In that cold room, I sensed my own death. In the corner was a sink with cracked tiles. Down that drain had gone all the clipped nails, hairs, and grains of dirt washed from the dead. The faucet had a leak, and with every drip I felt my life ebbing away. One day it would be all gone. The joy of being alive became so concentrated in me I wanted to scream. I was never a religious child, but suddenly I felt the need to beg God to spare me as long as possible. When my father came back, he found his son on his knees on the floor, with eyes squeezed shut and knuckles white. From then on, I was terrified that I or one of my parents were going to die. My mother worried me the most. She was the force around which our world turned. Unlike our father, who spent his life in the clouds, my mother was propelled through the universe by the brute force of reason. She was the judge in all of our arguments. One disapproving word from her was enough to send us off to hide in a corner, where we would cry and fantasize our own martyrdom. And yet, one kiss could restore us to princedom. Without her, our lives would dissolve into chaos. The fear of death haunted me for a year. I cried whenever anyone dropped a glass or broke a plate. But even when that passed, I was left with a sadness that couldn't be rubbed off. It wasn't that something new had happened. It was worse. I'd become aware of what had been with me all along without my notice. I dragged this new awareness around like a stone tied to my ankle. Wherever I went, it followed. I used to make up little sad songs in my head. I eulogized the falling leaves. I imagined my death in 100 different ways, but the funeral was always the same. From somewhere in my imagination out rolled a red carpet, because after every secret death I died, my greatness was always discovered. Things might have gone on like that. One morning, having wasted time over my breakfast, and then stopped to examine Miss Stanilovsky's giant underwear drying on the line, I was late to school. The bell had rang, but a girl in my class was kneeling in the dusty schoolyard. Her hair was braided down her back. She was cupping her hands around something. I asked her what it was. I caught a moth, she said, without looking at me. What do you want with a moth? I asked. What kind of question is that? She said. I rethought my question. Well, if it was a butterfly, that would be one thing, I said. It wouldn't, she said. It would be another thing. You should let it go, I said. It's a very rare moth, she said. How do you know? I asked. I have a feeling, she said. I pointed out that the bell had already rang. Then go in, she said. No one's stopping you. Not unless you let it go. Then you might have to wait forever. She opened the space between her thumbs and looked in. Let me see, I said. She didn't say anything. Can I please see it? She looked at me. Her eyes were green and sharp. All right, but be careful. She lifted her clasped hands to my face and parted her two thumbs a half-inch. I could smell the soap on her skin. All I could see was a little bit of brown wing, so I pulled on her thumb to get a better look. And yet, she must have thought I was trying to free the moth, because suddenly she clapped her hands shut. We looked at each other in horror. When she peeled her hands apart again, the moth jumped feebly in her palm. One wing had come off. She made a little gasp. I didn't do it, I said. When I looked at her eyes, I saw they were filled with tears. A feeling I didn't have to defend myself against her icy silence. But now she seemed different to me. I became aware of her special powers, how she seemed to pull light and gravity to the place where she stood. I noticed, as I had never before, the way her toes pointed slightly inward, the way her coat fit neatly across her narrow shoulders. As if my eyes had been given magnifying powers, I saw her more closely yet. The black beauty mark, like a fleck of ink above her lip, the pink, translucent shell of her ear, the blonde down on her cheeks. Inch by inch, she revealed herself to me. I half expected that in another moment I'd be able to make out the cells of her skin as if under a microscope, and a thought crossed my mind that had to do with the familiar worry that I'd inherited too much from my father. But it didn't last long, because at the same time that I was becoming conscious of her body, I was becoming aware of my own. The sensation almost knocked the breath out of me. A tingling feeling caught fire in my nerves and spread. The whole thing must have happened in less than 30 seconds, and yet, when it was over, I'd been initiated into the mystery that stands at the beginning of the end of childhood. It was years before I'd spent all the joy and pain born in me in that less than half a minute. Without another word, she dropped the broken moth and ran inside. The heavy iron door swung closed behind her with a thud. Alma. It's been a long time since I uttered that name. I resolved to make her love me, whatever the cost. But I knew enough. I knew enough not to attack right away. I watched her every move for the next couple of weeks. Patience had always been one of my virtues. Once I hid for 4 whole hours under the outhouse behind the rabbi's house to find out if the famous tzaddik who'd come to visit from Baranowitz really took shits like the rest of us. The answer was yes. In my enthusiasm for the coarse miracles of life, I shot out from under the outhouse shouting an affirmative. For this, I got 5 raps on the knuckles and had to kneel on corn cobs until my knees were bloody. But it was worth it. I considered myself a spy infiltrating an alien world, the domain of the female. With the excuse of gathering evidence, I stole Mrs. Stanislavski's enormous panties off the clothesline. Alone in the outhouse, I sniffed them with abandon. I buried my face in the crotch. I put them on my head. I raised them and let them balloon in the breeze like the flag of a new nation. When my mother pushed open the door, I was trying them on for size. They could have fit 3 of me. With one lethal look and the humiliating punishment of having to knock on Stanislavski's door and hand back her underwear, my mother put an end to the general portion of my research. And yet, I continued in the specific. There, my research was exhaustive. I found out that Alma was the youngest of 4 children, and her father's favorite. I knew her birthday was the 21st of February, making her older than me by 5 months and 28 days. That she loved the sour cherries and syrup that were smuggled from across the border in Russia, and that once she had consumed half a jar of these in secret, and when her mother found out, she made her eat the other half, thinking it would make her sick and turn her off the cherries forever. But it didn't. She ate the whole thing up and even claimed to a girl in our class that she could have eaten more. I knew that her father wanted her to learn how to play the piano, but that she wanted to learn the violin, and that this dispute remained unsettled, with both sides standing their ground until Alma got a hold of an empty violin case. She claimed to have found it discarded by the road and started carrying it around in her father's presence, sometimes even pretending to play the phantom violin, and that this was the straw that broke the camel's back. Her father caved in and arranged for a violin to be brought back from Vilna by one of her brothers who was studying at the gymnasium, and the new violin arrived in a shiny black leather case lined with purple velvet, and that every song Alma learned to play on it, no matter how sad, possessed the unmistakable tone of victory. I knew, because I heard her play while I stood outside her window, waiting for the secret to her heart to be revealed to me with the same ardor with which I'd waited for the great Sadek's shit. But it never happened. One day she marched around the side of the house and confronted me. I've seen you out there every day for the past week, and everyone knows you stare at me all day in school. If you have something you want to say to me, why don't you just say taped to my face instead of sneaking around like a crook. I considered my options. Either I could run away and never go back to school again, maybe even leave the country as a stowaway on a ship bound for Australia, or I could risk everything and confess to her. The answer was obvious. I was going to Australia. I opened my mouth to say goodbye forever, and yet, what I said was, "I want to know if you'll marry me." She was expressionless, but her eyes had the same gleam they got when she removed her violin from its case. A long moment passed, we were locked in a brutal stare. "I'll think about it," she said at last, and marched back around the corner of the house. I heard the door slam. A moment later, the opening notes of Songs My Mother Taught Me by Dvorak. And though she didn't say yes, from then on I knew I had a chance. That, in a nutshell, was the end of my preoccupation with death. Not that I stopped fearing it, I just stopped thinking about it. If I had any extra time on my hands that wasn't spent thinking about Alma, I might have spent them worrying about death. But the truth was that I learned to put a wall up against such thoughts. Each new thing I learned about the world was a stone in that wall, until one day I understood I'd exiled myself from a place I could never go back to. And yet, the wall also protected me from the painful clarity of childhood, even during the years when I hid in the forest, in trees, holes, and cellars, with death breathing down my neck. I still never thought about the truth, that I was going to die. Only after my heart attack, when the stones of the wall that separated me from childhood began to crumble at last, did the fear of death return to me, and it was just as frightening as it ever was. I sat hunched over the incredible, fantastic adventures of Frankie, Toothless Girl Wonder by Leopold Kirksky, who wasn't me. I didn't open the cover. I listened to the rain running through the roof gutters. I left the library. Crossing the street, I was hit head-on by a brutal loneliness. I felt dark and hollow. Abandoned, unnoticed, forgotten, I stood on the sidewalk, a nothing, a gatherer of dust. People hurried past me, and everyone who walked by was happier than I. I felt the old envy over and over until he got it down to a matter of seconds. From then on, I took an even greater pride in my work. I'd bring the most difficult locks home and time myself. Then I'd cut the time in half and practice until I got there. I'd keep at it until I couldn't feel my fingers. I was laying in bed, dreaming up more and more difficult challenges when it dawned on me. If I could pick the lock to a stranger's apartment, why couldn't I pick the lock to Gosar's Bailey's, or the public library, or Woolworth's? Hypothetically speaking, what was stopping me from picking the lock to Carnegie Hall? My thoughts raced while my body tingled with excitement. All I would do was let myself in and then let myself back out, perhaps leave a small signature. I planned for weeks. I staked out the premises. There was no stone I left unturned. Suffice to say, I did it. Through the backstage door on 56th Street in the early hours of the morning, it took me 103 seconds. At home, the same lock only took me 48, but it was cold out and my fingers were heavy. The great Arthur Rubinstein was scheduled to play that night. The piano was set up alone on the stage, a glossy black Steinway grand. I stepped out from behind the curtains. I could just make out the endless row of seats in the glow of the exit signs. I sat down on the bench and pushed down a pedal with the tip of my shoe. I didn't dare lay a finger on the keys. When I looked up, she was standing there, plain as day, a girl of 15, her hair in a braid, not 5 feet from me. She lifted her violin, the one her brother had brought her from Vilna, and lowered her chin to meet it. I tried to say her name, but it lodged in my throat. Besides, I knew she couldn't hear me. She raised her bow. I heard the opening notes of the Dvorak. Her eyes were closed. The music spilled from her fingers. She played it flawlessly, as she'd never played it in life. When the last note faded, she was gone. My claps echoed in the empty auditorium. I stopped and the silence thundered in my ears. I took one last look out at the empty theater. Then I hurried out the way I came. I never did it again. I'd proven it to myself, and that was enough. From time to time, I'd find myself passing the entrance of a certain private club. I won't name names, but I'd think to myself, Shalom, shinheads, here's a Jew you can't keep out. But after that night, I never pushed my luck again. If they threw me in jail, they'd find out the truth. I'm no Houdini. And yet, in my loneliness, it comforts me to think that the world's doors, however closed, are never truly locked to me. Such was the comfort I groped for, standing in the pouring rain outside the library while strangers hurried past. After all, wasn't this the real reason my cousin had taught me the trade? He knew I couldn't stay invisible forever. "Show me a Jew that survives," he once said as I watched a lock give way in his hands, "and I'll show you a magician." I stood on the street and let the rain trickle down my neck. I squeezed my eyes shut. Door after door after door after door after door after door swung open. After the library, after the nothing of the incredible, fantastic adventures of frankly toothless Girl Wonder, I went home. I took off my coat and hung it to dry, put the water on to boil. Behind me, someone cleared his throat. I nearly jumped out of my skin, but it was only Bruno, sitting in the dark. "What are you trying to do? Give me a conniption," I yelped, turning on the light. The pages of the book I wrote when I was a boy were scattered on the floor. "Oh no," I said. "It's not what you..." He didn't give me a chance. "Not bad," he said. "Not how I would have chosen to describe her, but what can I say? That's your business." "Look," I said. "You don't need to explain," he said. "It's a good book. I like the writing. Aside from the bits you stole, very inventive. If we're talking in purely literary terms..." It took me a moment, and then I realized the difference. He was speaking to me in Yiddish. "In purely literary terms, what's not to like? Anyway, I'd always wondered what you were working on. Now, after all these years, I know. But I wondered what you were working on," I said, remembering a lifetime ago when we were both 20 and wanted to be writers. He shrugged like only Bruno can. "The same as you. The same. Of course the same. A book about her." "A book about her," Bruno said. He looked away, out the window. Then I saw he was holding the photograph in his lap, the one of her and me in front of the tree on which she'd never he weren't there. Just one question, Bruno said now, 60 years later. I always wanted to know. What? He coughed. Then he looked up at me. Did she tell you you were a better writer than I? No, I lied, and then I told him the truth. No one had to tell me. There was a long silence. It's strange, I always thought, he broke off. What? I said. I thought we were fighting for something more than her love, he said. Now it was my turn to look out the window. What is more than her love? I asked. We sat in silence. I lied, Bruno said. I have another question. What is it? Why are you still standing here like a fool? What do you mean? Your book, he said. What about it? Go get it back. I knelt on the floor and began to gather up the pages. Not this one. Which one? Oy vey, Bruno said, slapping his forehead. Do I have to tell you everything? A slow smile spread on my lips. 301, said Bruno. He shrugged and looked away, but I thought I saw him smile. It's not nothing. We're starting a new chapter now. This one's called Flood. And it's starting to list things right off the bat. So, number 1. How to make a fire without matches. I did a search on the internet for Alma Maraminsky. I thought someone might have written about her, or that I might find information about her life. I typed in her name and pressed return, but all that came up was a list of immigrants who'd arrived in New York City in 1891. Mendel Maraminsky, and a list of Holocaust victims recorded at Yad Vashem, Adam Maraminsky, Fanny, Nasham, Zelig, Herschel, Bluma, Ida, but, to my relief, because I didn't want to lose her before I'd even begun to look, no Alma. Number 2. All the time my brother saves my life. Uncle Julian came to stay with us. He was in New York for as long as it took him to do the final research for a book he'd been writing for 5 years on the sculptor and painter Alberto Giacometti. Aunt Frances stayed behind in London to take care of the dog. Uncle Julian slept in Bert's bed. Bert slept in mine, and I slept on the floor in my 100% down sleeping bag. Even though a real expert wouldn't need one, since in emergency conditions, she could just kill some birds and stuff their feathers under her clothing for warmth. Sometimes at night I would hear my brother talking in his sleep. Half phrases, nothing I could make out, except for one, when he spoke so loudly I thought he was awake. Don't step there, he said. What? I said, sitting up. It's too deep, he muttered, and turned his face to the wall. Number 3. But why? One Saturday, Bert and I went up with Uncle Julian to the Museum of Modern Art. Bert insisted on paying for himself from his lemonade profits. We wandered around while Uncle Julian went to talk to a curator upstairs. Bert asked one of the security guards how many water fountains there were in the building. 5. He made weird video game noises until I told him to be quiet. Then he counted the number of people with exposed tattoos. 8. We stood in front of a painting of a bunch of people collapsed on the floor. Why are they lying there like that? He asked. Someone killed them, I said, even though I didn't really know why they were lying there, or if they were even people. I went to look at another painting across the room. Bert followed me. But why did someone kill them? He asked. Because they needed money and robbed a house, I said, and got on the escalator going down. On the subway home, Bert touched my shoulder. But why did they need the money? Number 4. Lost at Sea. What makes you think this Alma in History of Love is a real person? Misha asked. We were sitting on the beach behind his apartment building with our feet buried in the sand, eating Miss Swarovski's roast beef and horseradish sandwiches. I said. A what? A real person. Okay, Misha said. Answer the question. Of course she's real. But how do you know? Because there's only one way to explain why Litvinov, who wrote the book, didn't give her a Spanish name like everyone else. Why? He couldn't. Why not? Don't you see? I said. He could change every detail, but he couldn't change her. But why? His obtuseness frustrated me. Because he was in love with her. I said, because to him she was the only thing that was real. Misha chewed a bite of roast beef. I'm thinking you watch too many almost 4 inches and started to shave the dark hairs above his lip. When we went into the ocean, I watched his body as he dove into the waves, and it gave me a feeling in my stomach that wasn't an ache, but something different. I bet you $100 she's listed, I said. There was no part of me that actually believed this, but it was all I could think of to change the subject. Number 6. Looking for someone who most likely doesn't exist. I'm looking for a number for Alma Mereminsky, I said. Mereminsky. What bureau? The woman said. I don't know, I said. There was a pause and I heard the clicking of keys. Misha watched a girl in a turquoise bikini rollerblade past. The woman on the phone was saying something. Excuse me, I said. I said I have an A. Mereminsky on 147th in the Bronx, she said. Hold for the number. I scrolled it on my hand. Misha walked over. So, do you have a quarter? I asked. It was silly, but I'd already gone so far. He raised his eyebrows and reached into the pocket of his shorts. I dialed the number written on my palm. A man answered. Is Alma there? I asked. Who? He said. I'm looking for Alma Mereminsky. There's no Alma here, he told me. You got the wrong number. This is Artie, he said, and hung up. We walked back to Misha's apartment. I went to the bathroom, which smelled of his sister's perfume and was crowded with his father's grayish underwear drying on a line. When I came out, Misha was shirtless in his room, reading a book in Russian. I waited on his bed while he took a shower, flipping through the pages of Cyrillic. I could hear the water falling and the song he was singing, but not the words. When I lay on his pillow, it smelled of him. Number 7. If things go on like this, when Misha was young, his family went to their dasha every summer, and he and his father would take the nets down from the attic and try to catch the migrating butterflies that filled the air. The old house was filled with his grandmother's china that really came from China, and the framed butterflies 3 generations of Slavskys had caught as boys. Over time, their scales fell away, and if you ran barefoot through the house, the china would rattle and your feet would pick up wing dust. A few months back, the night before his 15th birthday, I had decided to make Misha a card with a butterfly on it. I went online for a picture of a Russian butterfly, but instead I found an article reporting that most butterfly species had declined in numbers over the last 2 decades, and that their extinction rate was about 10,000 times higher than it should be. It also said that an average of 74 species of insects, plants, and animals become extinct every day. Based on these and other frightening statistics, the article reported, scientists believe that we are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction in the history of life on Earth. Almost a quarter of the world's mammals face extinction within 30 years. 1 out of 8 species of birds will soon be extinct. 90% of the world's largest fish have disappeared in the last half-century. I did a search on mass extinction. The last mass extinction happened about 65 million years ago, when an asteroid probably collided with our planet, killing all the dinosaurs and about half of the marine animals. Before that was the Triassic extinction, also caused by an asteroid or possibly volcanoes, which wiped out up to 95% of the species, and before that was the late Devonian extinction. The current mass extinction will be the quickest in Earth's 4.5 billion year history and, unlike those other extinctions, isn't caused by natural events, but by the ignorance of human beings. If things go on like this, half of all species on Earth will be gone in 100 years. For this reason, I did not put any butterflies on Misha's card. Number 8. Interglacial. The same February, my mother got the letter asking her to translate the history of love. It snowed almost 2 feet, and Misha and I built a snow cave in the park. We worked for hours, and our fingers turned numb, but we kept digging. When it was finished, we crawled inside. A blue light came in through the entrance. We met shoulder to shoulder. Maybe one day I'll bring you to Russia, said Misha. We could go camping in the Ural Mountains, or just the Kafka steppes. Our breath made little clouds when we spoke. I'll take you to the room where I lived with my grandfather, said Misha, and teach you to skate on the Neva. I could learn Russian. Misha nodded. I'll teach you. First word, die. Die. Second word, Roku. What does that mean? Say it first. Roku. Die. someone escaped, there'd be no history of love. And if Alma was also from the same village, which I bet you $100 she was, you already owe me $100. The point is that in the parts I've read, there are stories about Alma when she was very young, like 10. So if she's real, which I think she is, Litvinov must have known her as a child. Which means they were probably from the same village. And Yad Vashem doesn't list any Alma Mereminsky from Poland who died in the Holocaust. Who is Yad Vashem? The Holocaust Museum in Israel. Okay, so maybe she's not even Jewish. And even if she is, even if she's real and Polish and Jewish and came to America, how do you know she didn't go to some other city? Like Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor! I have one cousin there, Misha said. Anyway, I thought you were looking for Jacob Marcus, not this Alma. I am, I said. I felt the back of his hand brush my thigh. I didn't know how to say that even though I'd started out looking for someone who could make my mother happy again. Now I was looking for something else, too. About the woman I was named after. And about me. Maybe the reason Jacob Marcus wants the book translated has something to do with Alma, I said. Not because I believed it, but because I didn't know what else to say. Maybe he knew her, or maybe he's trying to find her. I was glad Misha didn't ask me why. If Litvinov had been so in love with Alma, he hadn't followed her to America. Why he'd gone to Chile instead and married someone named Rosa. The only reason I could think of was that he didn't have a choice. On the other side of the wall, Misha's mother shouted something at his father. Misha propped himself up on his elbow and looked down at me. I thought of the time, the summer before, when we were 13 and stood on the roof of his building. The tar soft under our feet, our tongues in each other's mouths while he gave me a lesson in the Shklovsky School of Russian Kissing. Now we'd known each other for 2 years. The side of my calf was touching his shins, and his stomach was against my ribs. He said, I don't think it's the end of the world to be my girlfriend. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. It took 7 languages to make me. It would be nice if I could have spoken just one, but I couldn't, so he leaned down to kiss me. Number 10. Then. His tongue was in my mouth. I didn't know if I should touch my tongue to his or leave it off to the side so his tongue could move unconstrained by mine. Before I could decide, he took his tongue out and closed his mouth, and I accidentally left my mouth open, which seemed like a mistake. I thought that might be the end of it, but then he opened his mouth again and I didn't realize he was going to, so he ended up licking my lips. Then I opened my lips and stuck out my tongue, but it was too late because his tongue was back in his mouth. Then we got it right, sort of, opening our mouths at the same time like we were both trying to say something, and I put my hand around the back of his neck like Eva Marie Saint does to Cary Grant in the train car scene in North by Northwest. We rolled around a little, and his crotch sort of rubbed against my crotch, but only for a second, because then my shoulder got accidentally mashed against his accordion. There was saliva all around my mouth, and it was hard to breathe. Outside the window, an airplane passed on the way to JFK. His father started to shout back at his mother. What are they fighting about? I asked. Misha pulled his head back. A thought crossed his face in a language I couldn't understand. I wondered if things were going to change between us. Merde, he said. What does that mean? I asked, and he said, it's French. He tucked a strand of my hair around my ear and started to kiss me again. Misha, I whispered. Shh, he said, and slipped his hand under my shirt around my waist. Don't, I said, and sat up. And then I said, I like someone else. As soon as I said it, I regretted it. When it was clear there was nothing more to say, I put my sneakers on, which were filled with sand. My mother is probably wondering where I am, I said, which we both knew wasn't true. When I stood, there was the sound of sand scattering. Number 11. A week passed and Misha and I didn't speak. I studied edible plants and flowers in North America again for old time's sake. I went up to the roof of our house to see if I could identify any constellations, but there were too many lights, so I went back down to the backyard and practiced setting up Dad's tent in the dark, which I did in 3 minutes and 54 seconds, beating my record finished, I laid down in it and tried to remember as many things as I could about Dad. Number 12. Memories passed down to me from my father. So these are words in another language that she says, and then the definition is next to it. So you'll hear me say a word that I do not know how to say, and then the definition of it. And it's 9 or 10 of them. Okay. Egad, the taste of raw sugarcane. Statyim, the dirt streets in Tel Aviv when Israel was still a new country, and beyond them the fields of wild cyclamen. Shalosh, the rock he threw at a boy's head who bullied his older brother, gaining him respect among the other kids. Arba, buying chickens with his father at the Moshav, and watching their legs move after their necks were cut. Hamesh, the sound of cards being shuffled by his mother and her friends when they played canasta on Saturday nights after Shabbat. Shesh, the falls of Iguacu, which he traveled to alone at great effort and personal expense. Sheva, the first time he saw the woman who would become his wife, my mother, reading a book on the grass of Kibbutz Yavni, wearing yellow shorts. Shmon, the sound of cicadas at night, and also the silence. Tesha, the smell of jasmine, hibiscus, and orange flower. Esser, the paleness of my mother's skin. Number 13. 2 weeks passed. Misha and I still hadn't spoken. Uncle Julian hadn't left, and it was almost the end of August. The history of love has 39 chapters, and my mother had finished another 11 since she'd sent Jacob Marcus the first 10, bringing her to a total of 21. This meant she was more than halfway through and would be sending him another package soon. I locked myself in the bathroom, the only place I could get any privacy, and tried to work on a second letter to Jacob Marcus, but everything I tried to write sounded wrong or trite or like a lie, which it was. I was sitting on the toilet with a notepad on my knees. Next to my ankle was the waste bin, and in the waste bin was a crumpled piece of paper. I took it out. Dog. Francis, it said. Dog. Your words are cutting, but I suppose that's what you intended. I am not in love with Flo, as you say. We've been colleagues for years, and she happens to be someone who cares about the things I care about. Art, Fran. Remember art? Which, let's be honest, you couldn't give a rat's ass about anymore. You've made such a sport out of criticizing me that you haven't even noticed how much you've changed. How you hardly bear any resemblance at all to the girl I once. The letter broke off. I crumpled it back up carefully and replaced it in the waste bin. I shut my eyes tightly. I thought maybe Uncle Julian wouldn't be finishing his research on Alberto Giacometti anytime soon. So that is our Uncle Julian writing a letter to his wife, Fran. Number 14. Then I had an idea. They must record all the deaths somewhere. The births and the deaths. There must be a place, an office or a bureau somewhere in the city that keeps track of them all. There must be files upon files of people who've been born and died in New York City. Sometimes, driving along the BQE as the sun is going down, you get a view of all those thousands of gravestones. As the skyline goes up in lights and the sky glows orange, and you get the weird feeling that the city's electrical power is generated from everyone buried there. And so I thought, maybe they have a record of her. Number 15. The next day was Sunday. It was raining outside, so I sat around reading The Street of Crocodiles, which I checked out of the library, and wondered if Misha was going to call. I knew I was onto something when the introduction said that the author was from a village in Poland. I thought, either Jacob Marcus really likes Polish writers, or he's dropping me a clue. I mean, my mother. The book wasn't long, and I finished it that afternoon. At 5, Bird came home, drenched. It's starting, he said, touching the mezuzah on the kitchen door and kissing his hand. What's starting? I asked. The rain. It's supposed to stop tomorrow, I said. He poured himself a glass of orange juice, drank it down, and went back through the door, kissing a total of 4 mezuzahs before he reached his room. Uncle Julian came in from his stay at the museum. Have you seen Bird's Clubhouse? He asked, off the counter and peeling it over the trash. It's rather impressive, don't you think? But Monday the rain didn't stop and Misha didn't call. So I put my raincoat on, found an umbrella, and headed out for the New York City Municipal Archives, which, according to the internet, is where they keep the records of births and deaths. Number 16, 31 Chambers Street, room 103. Mereminsky, I said to the man with round black glasses behind the desk. Mereminsky. M-E-R, the man said, writing it down. E-M-I-N-S-K-I. I-S-K-Y, the man said. No, I said. M-E-R. M-E-R, he said. E-M-I-N, I said. And he said, E-Y-N. No, I said. E-M-I-N. He stared at me blankly, so I said, why don't I write it for you? He looked at the name, then he asked me if Alma Mereminsky was my grandmother or great-grandmother. Yes, I said, because I thought it might speed up the process. Which, he said. Great, I said. He looked at me and chewed on a cuticle, then went into the back and came out with a box of microfilm. When I fed the first roll in, it got caught. I tried to get the man's attention by waving and pointing at the dangle of film. He came over, sighed, and thudded it through. After the third roll, I got the hang of it. I scrolled through all 15. There was no Alma Mereminsky in that box, so we brought out another and another after that. I had to go to the bathroom, and on the way out, I got a package of Twinkies and a Coke from the machine. The man came out and got a Snickers bar. To make conversation, I said, do you know anything about how to survive in the wild? His face twitched and he pushed his glasses up his nose. What do you mean? For example, do you know that almost all Arctic vegetation is edible? Except for certain mushrooms, of course. He raised his eyebrows, so I said, well, did you know that you can starve by just eating rabbit meat? It's a documented fact that people who are trying to survive have died by eating too much rabbit. If you eat a lot of any kind of lean meat, like rabbit, you get, you know. Anyway, it can kill you. The man threw out the rest of his Snickers. Back inside, he brought out a fourth box. 2 hours later, my eyes hurt and I was still there. Is it possible she died after 1948? The man asked, visibly flustered. I told him it was possible. Well, why didn't you say? In that case, her death certificate wouldn't be here. Where would it be? New York City Department of Health. Division of Vital Records, he said. 125 Worth Street, room 133. They have all the tests after 48. I thought, great. Number 17. The worst mistake my mother ever made. When I got home, my mother was curled up on the couch reading a book. What are you reading? I asked. Cervantes, she said. Cervantes, I asked. The most famous Spanish writer, my mother said, turning the page. I rolled my eyes at her. Sometimes I wonder why she didn't just marry a famous writer instead of a wilderness-loving engineer. If she had, none of this would have ever happened. Right now, at this very moment, she'd probably be sitting at the dinner table with her famous writer husband, talking about the pros and cons of other famous writers, while making the difficult decision of who was worthy of a posthumous Nobel. That night, I dialed Misha's number, but hung up on the first ring. Number 18. Then it was Tuesday. It was still raining. On the way to the subway, I passed the vacant lot where Bird had hung a tarp over the pile of junk that had grown to 6 feet tall, with trash bags and old ropes strung off the sides. A pole rose up from out of the mass, possibly waiting for a flag. The lemonade stand was also still there, as was the sign that said Yeah, I said. There was an awkward silence. I said, well, I was calling to see if you want to rent Topaz tonight. Can't. Why? I have plans. What plans? I'm going to see a movie. With who? Girl I know. My stomach turned itself inside out. What girl? I thought. Please don't let it be Luba, he said. Maybe you remember. You met her once. Of course I remembered. How can you forget a girl who is 5'9", blonde, and claims to be a descendant of Catherine the Great? It was turning out to be a bad day. Meremski, I said to the woman behind the desk in room 133. I thought, how could he like a girl who couldn't do the universal edibility test if her life depended on it? M-E-R-E, the woman said. So I said, M-I-N-S, thinking, she probably hasn't ever heard of Rear Window. M-Y-M-S, the woman said. No, I said, M-I-N-S. M-I-N-S, the woman said. K-I, I said, and she said, K-I. An hour passed and we didn't find any death certificate for Alma Meremski. Another half hour passed and we still didn't find it. Loneliness turned into depression. After 2 hours, the woman said she was absolutely 100% positive there was no Alma Meremski, who died in New York City after 1948. That night I rented North by Northwest again and watched it for the 11th time. Then I went to sleep. Number 19. Lonely people are always up in the middle of the night. When I opened my eyes, Uncle Julian was standing above me. How old are you? He asked. 14. I'll be 15 next month. 15 next month, he said, as if we were turning a math problem over in his head. What do you want to be when you grow up? He was still wearing his raincoat, which was soaking wet. A drop of water fell in my eye. I don't know. Come on, there must be something. I sat up in my sleeping bag, rubbed my eye. I looked at my digital watch. There's a button you can press to make the numbers glow. It also has a built-in compass. It's 3:24 in the morning, I said. Bird was asleep in my bed. I know, I was just wondering. Tell me and I promise I'll let you go back to sleep. What do you want to be? I thought, someone Messiah. Also, my wrist is getting better. If you want to know how I sprained it by climbing up the roof because I got to Hebrew school early and the door was locked, and there was a ladder attached to the side of the building. The ladder was rusty, but otherwise it was not that hard. There was a big puddle of water in the middle of the roof, so I decided to see what would happen if I bounced my jack ball in it and tried to catch it. It was fun. I did it about 15 more times until I lost it when it went over the edge. Then I lay on my back and looked up at the sky. I counted 3 airplanes. When I got bored, I decided to go down. It was harder than going up because I had to go backwards. Halfway, I passed the windows of one of the classrooms. I could see Mrs. Zucker at the front, so I knew it was the Tillets. If you want to know, this year I'm a hay. I have no idea what these words mean. I couldn't hear what Mrs. Zucker was saying, so I tried to read her lips. I had to lean off of the ladder very far to get a good view. I pressed my face right against the window, and suddenly everyone turned to look at me, so I waved, and that's when I lost my balance. I fell, and Rabbi Weisner said it was a miracle that I didn't break anything, but deep inside I knew I was safe the whole time, and that God wouldn't let anything happen to me because I am almost definitely a lame dvovnik. April 11th. Today was my 5th day of being normal. Alma says that if I were normal, it would make my life easier, not to mention everyone else's life. I got to take the ace bandage off my wrist, and now it only hurts a little. It probably hurt a lot more when I broke my wrist when I was 6, but I don't remember. I skipped ahead until I came to June 27th. So far I've made $295.50 from selling lemonade. That's 591 cups. My best customer is Mr. Goldstein, who buys 10 cups at one time because he's extremely thirsty. Also Uncle Julian, who tipped me $20 once. Only $384.50 to go. June 28th. Today I almost did something not normal. I was passing a building on 4th Street and there was a plank of wood leaning against the scaffolding, and no one was around, and I really wanted to take it. It wouldn't have been like regular stealing, since the special thing I am building will help people and God wants me to build it. But I also know that if I stole it and someone found out, I would get in trouble, and then Alma would have to come get me and she would be angry. But I bet she won't be angry anymore when it starts to rain and I finally tell her what the special thing is I've started to build. I've already collected a lot of stuff for it, mostly things that people have thrown away with the garbage. One thing I need a lot of that's hard to find is styrofoam because it floats. Right now I don't have that much. Sometimes I worry that it will start raining before I am finished building. If Alma knew about what is going to happen, I also don't think she'd be so upset that I wrote Hebrew words on her notebook. I have read all 3 volumes of How to Survive in the Wild, and they are very good and filled with interesting and useful facts. One part is all about what to do if there is a nuclear bomb, even though I don't think there is going to be a nuclear bomb. Just in case, I read it very carefully. Then I decided that if there is a nuclear bomb before I get to Israel and ashes fall everywhere like snow, I'm going to make angels. I'll walk through anyone's house I want because everyone will be gone. I won't be able to go to school, but it doesn't really matter since we never learn anything important anyway, like what happens after you die. Anyway, I'm just joking because there's not going to be a bomb. What there's going to be is a flood. Number 23. Outside, it was still coming down. We're starting a new chapter now. This is called Here We Are Together. On his last morning in Poland, after his friend pulled his hat down over his eyes and disappeared around the corner, Livanov walked back to his room. It was already empty, the furniture sold or given away. His suitcases stood at the door. He took out the brown paper package he'd been holding inside his coat. It was sealed, and on the front, in his friend's familiar handwriting, was written, "To be held for Leopold Gursky until you see him again." Livanov slipped it into the pocket of his suitcase. He walked to the window and looked out at the tiny square of sky for the last time. Church bells rang in the distance, as they'd rung hundreds of times while he worked or slept, so often that they felt like the workings of his own mind. He ran his fingers across the wall, pitted with tack marks where the pictures and articles he'd cut out of the newspaper used to hang. He paused to examine himself in the mirror so that later he would be able to recall exactly how he'd looked on that day. the closest siblings in age and appearance. They often had been mistaken for twins when they were little, even though Miriam was fairer and wore tortoiseshell glasses. She'd been in law school in Warsaw until she'd been forbidden to attend classes. The only expense Litvinov allowed himself was a shortwave radio. Every night he spun the dial between his fingers, roaming the continent of South America until he found the news station, the Voice of America. He only spoke a little English, but it was enough. He listened with horror to the progress of the Nazis. Hitler broke his pact with Russia and invaded Poland. Things went from bad to terrifying. The few letters from friends and relatives came less and less often, and it was difficult to know what was really happening. Folded inside the second-to-last letter he received from his sister, in which she told him she'd fallen in love with another law student and gotten married, was a photograph taken when she and Zvi were children. On the back she'd written, "Here we are, together." In the mornings, Litvinov made the coffee listening to stray dogs fight in the alley. He waited for the streetcar, already baking in the early sun. He ate lunch in the back of the pharmacy, surrounded by boxes of pills and powders and cherry syrup and hair ribbons. And at night, after he'd finished mopping the floors and polishing all the jars until he could see his sister's face in them, he came home. He didn't make many friends. He was no longer in the business of making friends. When he wasn't working, he was listening to the radio. He listened until he was exhausted and fell asleep in his chair. And even then he listened, his dreams taking shape around the voice of the broadcast. There were other refugees around him experiencing the same fears and helplessness, but Litvinov didn't find any comfort in this, because there are two types of people in the world: those who prefer to be sad among others, and those who prefer to be sad alone. Litvinov preferred to be alone. When people invited him for dinner, he begged off with some excuse. Once, when his landlady invited him for tea on a Sunday, he told her he had to finish something he was writing. "You write?" she asked, surprised. "What do you write?" As far as Litvinov was concerned, one lie was just as good as another, and so, without giving it much thought, he said, "Poems." A rumor got started that he was a poet, and Litvinov, secretly flattered, did nothing to quash it. He even bought a hat of the kind worn by Alberto Santos Dumont, who the Brazilians claim made the first ever successful flight, and whose Panama hat, Litvinov had heard, warped from fanning the plane's engine, was still popular among literary types. The old German Jew died in his sleep, the pharmacy was closed, and, partly on the strength of rumors of his literary prowess, Litvinov was hired as a teacher at a Jewish day school. The war ended. Bit by bit, Litvinov learned what had happened to his sister Miriam, and to his parents, and to 4 of his other siblings. What had become of his oldest brother, Andrei, he could only piece together from probabilities. He learned to live with the truth. Not to accept it, but to live with it. It was like living with an elephant. His room was tiny, and every morning he had to squeeze around the truth just to get to the bathroom, to reach the armoire, to get a pair of underpants. He had to crawl under the truth, praying it wouldn't choose that moment to sit on his face. At night, when he closed his eyes, he felt it looming above him. He lost weight. Everything about him seemed to shrink, except his ears and nose, which sagged and grew longer, giving him a melancholy look. The year he turned 32, his hair came out in fistfuls. He abandoned the warped Panama hat and took to wearing a heavy coat everywhere, in whose inside pocket he kept a worn and wrinkled piece of paper that he'd carried with him for years. was red with black polka dots, but Livanov refused to relinquish the memory of a sleeveless emerald chiffon. Only after she'd been sitting with him for half an hour and her friends had lost interest and turned back to their conversations did Livanov realize that her gesture had been sincere. There was an awkward pause in the conversation. Rosa smiled. "I haven't even introduced myself," she said. "You're Rosa," Livanov said. The next afternoon, Rosa turned up for a second meeting just as she'd promised. When she glanced at her watch and realized how late it had got, they planned a third meeting, and after that it went without saying that there'd be a fourth. The fifth time they met, under the spell of Rosa's youthful spontaneity, halfway through a heated discussion about who was a greater poet, Neruda or Dario, Livanov surprised himself by proposing they go hear a concert together. When Rosa jumped to agree, it dawned on him that, miracle of miracles, this lovely girl might actually be developing feelings for him. It was as if someone had struck a gong on his chest. His whole body reverberated with the news. A few days after the date at the concert, they met in the park and had a picnic. This was followed the next Sunday by a bicycle ride. On their seventh date, they saw a movie. When it was over, Livanov walked Rosa home. They were standing together, discussing the merits of Grace Kelly's acting versus her unbelievable beauty, when all of a sudden Rosa leaned forward and kissed him. Or at least she tried to kiss him, but Livanov, taken off guard, backed away, leaving Rosa tipped forward at an awkward angle, neck outstretched. All night, he'd been monitoring the ebb and flow of distance between their various body parts with growing pleasure, but the shifting measurements had been so fractional that this sudden charge by Rosa's nose almost reduced him to tears. Realizing his mistake, he blindly stuck his neck out into the gulf. But by then, Rosa had already counted her losses and pulled back into safer territory. Livanov hung in the balance, enough time for a waft of Rosa's perfume to tickle his nose, and then he beat a hasty retreat. Or he began to beat a hasty retreat when Rosa, not wanting to take any more chances, shot put her lips into the contested space, momentarily forgetting that appendage, her nose, which she remembered a fraction of a second later when it collided with Livanov's. At the instant, his lips mashed against hers, so that with their first kiss, they became blood relatives. Livanov was giddy on the bus ride home. He flashed a smile at anyone who looked his way. He walked down his street whistling, but as he slipped the key into his lock, a coolness entered his heart. He stood in his dark room without turning on the lamp. For God's sake, he thought, where is your head? What in the world could you offer a girl like that? Don't be a fool. You've let yourself fall apart. The pieces have got lost, and now there's nothing left to give. You can't hide it forever. Sooner or later she'll figure out the truth. You're a shell of a man. All she has to do is knock against you to find out you're empty. For a long time he stood with his head against the window, thinking about everything. Then he took off his clothes. Feeling in the dark, he washed out his underwear and hung them to dry on the radiator. He turned the dial on the radio, which glowed and came to life, but a minute later turned it off again and a tango broke off into silence. He sat naked in his chair. A fly landed on his shriveled penis. He mumbled some words, and because it felt good to mumble, he mumbled some more. They were words he knew by heart because he'd been carrying them on a piece of paper folded in his breast pocket since that night, all those years ago, when he'd watched over his friend, praying for him not to die. He'd said them so many times, even when he didn't know he was saying them, that sometimes he actually forgot that the words weren't his. That night, Livanov went to the closet and brought down his suitcase. Reaching a hand into the pocket, he felt around for a thick paper envelope. He pulled it out, sat back down in his chair, and placed it on his lap. arses, I told him. Except that with my mouth open, it came out as, hold your arses. I could just make out the numbers. 9:45, I said, or rather, 9 RDI. What time is it now? Bruno demanded. I worked my gaze back down to my watch. 9:43, I said. We started to run. Not run, but move in such a way that two people who've worn away all manner of balls and sockets move if they want to catch a train. I had the lead, but Bruno was hot on my heels. Then Bruno, who'd hit upon a way to pump his arms for speed that defies all description, edged me out, and for a moment I coasted while he quote-unquote broke the wind. I was concentrating on the back of his neck when, without warning, it plummeted from view. I looked behind. He was in a pile on the floor, one shoe off, one on. Go, he shouted at me. I floundered, not knowing what to do. Go, he shouted again. So I went, and next thing I knew, he'd got a corner and pulled out ahead again, shoe in hand, pumping rapidly. All aboard track 22. Bruno headed down the stairs toward the platform. I was right behind. There was every reason to believe we'd make it. And yet, in an unexpected change of plans, he skidded to a halt just as he reached the train. Unable to break my speed, I barreled past him into the car. The doors closed behind me. He smiled at me through the glass. I banged the window with my fist. Damn you, Bruno. He waved. He knew I wouldn't have gone alone. And yet, he knew I needed to go. Alone. The train started to pull away. His lips moved. I tried to read them. Good, he said. His lips paused. What is good? I wanted to shout. Tell me what is good. And they said, luck. The train lurched out of the station and into the dark. 5 days after the brown envelope had arrived with the pages of the book I'd written half a century ago, I was on my way to get back the book I'd written half a century later. Or, to say it differently, a week after my son died, I was on my way to his house. Either way, I was on my own. I found a seat by the window and tried to catch my breath. We sped through the tunnel. I leaned my head against the glass. Someone had scratched nice boobs into the surface. Impossible not to wonder whose. The train broke into the dirty light and rain. It was the first time in my life I'd gotten on a train without a ticket. A man got on at Yonkers and sat down next to me. He took out a paperback. My stomach growled. I hadn't put anything in it yet, if you didn't count the coffee I drank with Bruno that morning at Dunkin' Donuts. It was early. We'd been the first customers. Give me a jelly and a powdered, Bruno said. Give him a jelly and a powdered, I said, and I'll have a small coffee. The man in the paper hat paused. It's cheaper if you get a medium. America, God bless it. All right, I said, make it a medium. The man went off and came back with the coffee. Give me a Bavarian cream and a glazed, Bruno said. I shot him a look. What? He said, shrugging. Give him a Bavarian cream, I said. And a vanilla, said Bruno. I turned to glare at him. Mea culpa, he said. Vanilla. Go sit down, I told him. He stood there. Sit, I said. Make it a cruller, he said. The Bavarian cream was gone in 4 bites. He licked his fingers, then held the cruller up to the light. It's a donut, not a diamond, I said. It's stale, said Bruno. Eat it anyway, I told him. Change it for an apple spice, he said. The train left the city behind. Green fields fell away to either side. It had been raining for days, and it kept raining. Many times I'd imagined where Isaac lived. I'd found it on a map. Once I even called up information. If I want to get from Manhattan to my son, I asked, how do I go? I'd pictured it all, down to the last detail. Happy days, I'd come bearing a gift. A pot of jam, perhaps. We wouldn't stand on ceremony. Too late for all that. Maybe we'd toss a ball around on the lawn. I can't catch, nor, frankly, can I throw. And yet, we'd talk baseball. I've followed the game since Isaac was a boy. When he rooted for the Dodgers, I, too, was rooting. I wanted to see what he saw and hear what he heard. I kept abreast, as much as possible, of popular music. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan. Lay, lady, lay. You don't need a brass bed to understand it. and yet no one came. Finally, I stopped a kid who came out of the building. "You know the Moritz family?" He stared at me. "Yeah, so what?" he said. "They still live here?" I asked. "What's it to you?" he said, and started to go off down the street, bouncing a rubber ball. I grabbed him by the collar. There was a look of fear in his eyes. "They moved to Long Island," he blurted out, and took off running. A week later, a letter arrived from Alma. She had my address because once a year on her birthday, I sent her a card. "Happy birthday," I'd write, "from Leo." I tore open her letter. "I know you watch him," she wrote. "Don't ask me how, but I know. I keep waiting for the day when he'll ask for the truth. Sometimes when I look in his eyes, I see you, and I think you're the only one who could answer his questions. I hear your voice like you were next to me." I read the letter I don't know how many times, but that's not the point. What mattered was that in the upper left corner of the envelope she'd written the return address, 121 Atlantic Avenue, Long Beach, New York. I got out my map and memorized the details of the journey. I used to fantasize about disasters, floods, earthquakes, the world thrown into chaos so that I'd have a reason to go to him and sweep him up under my coat when I'd given up the hope of accentuating circumstances. I started to dream about our being thrown together by chance. I calculated all the ways our lives might casually intersect, finding myself sitting beside him on a train or in the waiting room of a doctor's office. But in the end, I knew that it was up to me. When Alma was gone, and 2 years later, Mordecai, there had been nothing anymore to stop me. And yet, 2 hours later, the train pulled into the station. I asked the person in the ticket booth how I could get a taxi. It had been a long time since I'd been out of the city. I stood in wonder of the greenness of everything. We drove for some time. We turned off the main road onto a smaller road, then a smaller one yet. At last, up a bumpy wooded drive in the middle of nowhere. It was hard to imagine a son of mine living in such a place. Say he got a craving for a pizza. Where would he go? Say he wanted to sit alone in a dark movie theater or watch some kids kissing in Union Square. Alright. Leo Gerksky, you're a creep. Okay, I'm saying it. God. A White House came into view. A little wind was chasing the clouds. Between the branches, I saw a lake. I'd imagined this place many times, but never with a lake. The oversight pained me. "You can drop me here," I said, before we reached the clearing. I half expected someone to be home. As far as I knew, Isaac had lived by himself, but you never know. The taxi came to a halt. I paid and got out, and it backed away down the drive. I made up a story about my car breaking down and needing a phone, took a deep breath, and pulled my collar up against the rain. I knocked. There was a bell, so I rang it. I knew he was dead, but a small part of me still hoped. I imagined his face as he would pull open the door. What would I have said to him, my only child? "Forgive me, your mother didn't love me the way I wanted to be loved. Perhaps I didn't love her the way she needed either." And yet, there was no answer. I waited just to be sure. When no one came, I walked around to the back. There was a tree on the lawn which reminded me of the tree on which I'd once carved our initials, A+L, and she never knew. Just as for 5 years I never knew that our sum had come to equal a child. The grass was slippery with mud. In the distance I could see a rowboat tied to the dock. I looked out across the water. Must have been a good swimmer, took after his father, I thought with pride. My own father, who had great respect for nature, had dropped each of us into the river soon after we were born, before our ties to the amphibians, so he claimed, "We're cut completely." My sister Hannah blamed her lisp on the trauma of this memory. I like to think that I would have done it differently. I would have held my son in my arms. I would have told him, "Once upon a time you were a fish." "A fish?" He would have asked. "That's what I'm telling you, a fish." "How do you know?" "Because I was also a fish." "You too?" "Sure, a long time ago." "How long?" "Long." "Anyway, being a fish, you used to know how to swim." "I did." "Sure. You were a great swimmer, a champion swimmer you were. You loved the water. Why? What do you mean, why? Why did I love the water?" "Because it was your life." And as we talked, I would have let him go, one but smoke. This is Isaac's house, I told myself. I took off my raincoat and hung it on a hook next to another. It was brown tweed with a brown silk lining. I lifted his sleeve and touched it to my cheek. I thought, this is his coat. I brought it to my nose and inhaled. There was a faint smell of cologne. I took it down and tried it on. The sleeves were too long, but no matter. I pushed them up. I took off my shoes, which were caked with mud. There was a pair of running sneakers, curled at the toes. I slipped them on my feet like a regular Mr. Rogers. The sneakers were at least a size 11, maybe 11 and a half. My father had tiny feet. When my sister got married to a boy from a nearby village, he spent the whole wedding staring with regret at the size of his new son-in-law's feet. I can only imagine his shock as he lived to see his grandsons. Like so, I entered my son's house, draped in his coat, his shoes on my feet. I was as close as I'd ever been to him, as far away. I dropped down the narrow hallway that led to the kitchen. Standing in the middle of the room, I waited for the police sirens that didn't come. There was a dirty dish in the sink, a glass left upside down to dry, a hardened tea bag in a saucer. On the kitchen table, there was some spilled salt. A postcard was taped to the window. I took it down and turned it over. Dear Isaac, it began. I'm sending this from Spain, where I've been living for a month. I'm writing to say that I haven't read your book, and I'm not going to. Behind me, there was a bang. I clutched my chest. I thought I was going to turn around and see Isaac's ghost, but it was only the door blown open by the wind. With shaking hands, I put the postcard back where I found it and stood in silence, my heart in my ears. The floorboards creaked under my weight. There were books everywhere. There were pens and a blue glass vase, an ashtray from the Dolder Grand in Zurich, the rusted arrow of a weather vane, a little brass hourglass, sand dollars on the windowsill, a pair of binoculars, an empty wine bottle that served as a candle holder, wax melted down the neck. I touched this thing and that. At the end, all that's left of you is your possessions. Perhaps that's why I've never been able to throw anything away. Perhaps that's why I hoarded the world, with the hope that when I died, the sum total of my things would suggest a life larger than the one I lived. I felt dizzy and grabbed the mantel for support. I went back into Isaac's kitchen. I didn't have an appetite, but I opened the refrigerator anyway because the doctor told me I shouldn't go without eating. Something to do with my blood pressure. A strong odor hit my nostrils. It was some leftover chicken gone bad. I threw it out, along with a couple of brown peaches and some moldy cheese. Then I washed the dirty dish. I don't know how to describe the feeling I had, going through these casual motions in my son's house. I did them with love. The glass I put back in the cabinet. The tea bag I threw away. The saucer I rinsed. There were probably people, the man in the yellow bow tie, or a future biographer, who wanted to leave things exactly as Isaac had. Perhaps one day they would even make a museum of his life, brought to you by the people who saved the glass from which Kafka took his last sip, the plate from which Mandelstam ate his last crumbs. Isaac was a great writer, the writer I could never have been. And yet, he was also my son. I went upstairs. With every door and cabinet and drawer I opened, I learned something new about Isaac. And with each new thing I learned, his absence became more real. And the more real, the more impossible to believe. I opened his medicine cabinet. Inside were 2 bottles of talcum powder. I don't even really know what talcum powder is or why one would use it, but this single fact about his life moved me more than any detail I'd ever imagined. I opened his closet and pushed my face into his shirts. He liked the color blue. I picked up a pair of brown wingtips. The heels were worn down to almost nothing. I put my nose inside and sniffed. I found his watch on the night table and put it on. The leather strap was worn around the hole where he used to buckle it. His wrist had been thicker than mine. When had he grown bigger than me? What had I been doing, and what had he? At the exact moment my son had surpassed me in size. The bed was neatly made. Had he died in it? Or had he felt it coming and gotten up to greet his childhood again, once did someone die in my arms. I was working as a janitor in a hospital. This was the winter of 1941. It was only a brief while. In the end, I lost the job. But one evening, during my last week, I was mopping the floor when I heard someone gagging. It was coming from the room of a woman who had a disease of the blood. I ran to her. Her body twisted and convulsed. I took her in my arms. I think I can say there was no question in either of our minds about what was about to happen. She had a child. I knew because I'd seen him visit once with his father, a little boy in polished boots and a coat with gold buttons. He sat playing with a toy car the whole time, ignoring his mother unless she spoke to him. Perhaps he was angry at her for leaving him alone with his father for so long. As I looked into her face, it was him I thought of, the boy who would grow up without knowing how to forgive himself. I felt a certain relief and pride, even superiority, to be filling the task that he couldn't. And then, less than a year later, that son whose mother died without him was me. There was a noise behind me, a creak. This time I didn't turn. I squeezed my eyes shut. "Isaac," I whispered. The sound of my own voice frightened me, but I didn't stop. "I want to tell you," and then I broke off. "What do I want to tell you?" "The truth." "What is the truth?" "That I mistook your mother for my life." "No, Isaac," I said. "The truth is the thing I invented so I could live." Now I turned and saw myself in the mirror on Isaac's wall, a fool in fool's clothes. I'd come to get back my book, but now I didn't care whether I found it or not. I thought, let it be lost like the rest. It didn't matter, not anymore. And yet, in the corner of the mirror, reflected from across the hall, I saw his typewriter. No one had to tell me it was the same as mine. I'd read in a newspaper interview that he'd been writing on the same manual Olympia for almost 25 years. A few months later, I saw the exact model for sale in a second-hand shop. The man said it worked, so I bought it. In the beginning, I just liked to look at it, to know that my son was looking at it, too. Day in and day out, it sat there smiling at me, as if the keys were teeth. Then I had the heart attack, and still it smiled. So one day, I rolled a sheet in and wrote a sentence. I crossed the hall. I thought, what if I found my book there, on his desk? The strangeness of it hit me. I in his coat, my book on his desk. He with my eyes, I in his shoes. All I wanted was proof that he'd read it. I sat down in his chair in front of his typewriter. The house felt cold. I put his coat around me. I thought I heard laughter, but told myself it was only the little boat creaking in the storm. I thought I heard footsteps on the roof, but told myself it was only an animal foraging for food. I rocked a little, the way my father used to rock when he prayed. Once my father told me, when a Jew prays, he is asking God a question that has no end. Darkness fell. Rain fell. I never asked, what question? And now it's too late, because I lost you, Tate. One day, in the spring of 1938, on a rainy day that gave way to a break in the clouds, I lost you. You'd gone out to collect specimens for a theory you were hatching about rainfall, instinct, and butterflies. And then you were gone. We found you lying under a tree, your face splashed with mud. We knew you were free then, unbound by disappointing results, and we buried you in the cemetery where your father was buried, and his father, under the shade of a chestnut tree. 3 years later, I lost Mama. The last time I saw her, she was wearing her yellow apron. She was stuffing things in a suitcase. The house was a wreck. She told me to go out into the woods. She'd packed me food and told me to wear my coat, even though it was July. Go, she said. I was too old to listen, but like a child I listened. She told me she'd follow the next day. We chose a spot we both knew in the woods. The giant walnut tree you used to like, Tate, because you said it had human qualities. I didn't bother to say goodbye. I chose to believe what was easier. I waited, but she never came. I lost Herschel to the rain. I lost Joseph to a crack in time. I lost the sound of laughter. I lost a pair of shoes. I'd taken them off to sleep. The shoes Herschel gave me, and when I woke, they were gone. I walked barefoot for days, and then I broke down and stole someone else's. I lost the only woman I ever wanted to love. I lost years. I lost books. I lost the house where I was born. And I lost Isaac. So who is to say that somewhere along the way, without my knowing, I didn't also lose my mind? My book was nowhere to be found. Aside from myself, there was no sign of me. Hey. 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 I'm gonna read you more of this bedtime story. This is my grandparents' house. And this is also my grandpa's shirt. I was gonna do this sitting in his chair, but I realized how nice the fireplace looks, and I did plan to do at least one of my videos in front of the fireplace, so this is where we're at. I really hope my mic is working too, I'm not sure. I tried to test it, but it sounded a little iffy, so I'm really sorry if it's weird. I'll get a new one when I can. Okay. Can you believe I've kept my place in this book with this tiny, tiny, tiny piece of paper? I can tell this is where the book starts to get good because nowhere have I marked the book except for here. You wait, reread the whole book. Sorry if you hear my dog snoring. Big Rider, she jerked her thumb upwards. Top floor on the right. This is giving me super Tyler Durden vibes. Holy crap. Living off knocked. Oh my gosh, my boobage is so bad. I'm sorry, y'all. Until the writing hand hurts. I identify with that. Okay, I don't fully understand yet, but to help you understand what I'm starting to understand. Somebody had rewritten his book, and this is what we've been reading about Buenos Aires. And apparently, Buenos Aires has always been Slanim. So everything we've read about Slanim and Buenos Aires is the same. Leo Kirksky, you tried to make sense. That is so weird because I literally had someone tell me once that I try to find the meaning in everything. Or that I do find the meaning in everything. I can't remember which one. But that always has stuck with me. I don't know. It's kind of pointless though. Like, is there a meaning to a lot of things? Not really. So. Okay, where was I? Dang it. Oh my gosh. My stomach is making so many noises. Dang it. Just a little bit longer, dummy. Okay, gosh. Oh god. I'm filming this mid-August, and it might not be coming out until like either the very end of August or even September. I think it'll be Maybe it's the same, I don't know, but for me, it was hard to figure out just now. Okay, anyway. This was a man who could slit. And now I can't read, of course. Okay. Is it raining? Okay, where was I? Dang it. But why did they need the money? That was my dog. Gosh. And just like my last video, I have had to restart this 3 different times. Dang it. And it's because my grandma called me again. But this time I got it. As it was happening. Dang it. I was so close to finishing. Okay. And now my skirt's all freaking messed up. She tells me that she's coming, and then she calls me 30 minutes later to tell me that she's not coming. Like, what? And then I bet you she's gonna call again. Oh my gosh, okay. Gotta love how unreliable and unpredictable my family is. Just kidding, it's absolutely daunting. We walked back to Misha's apartment. Oh wait, I need to do this. I don't know how well you can hear that car outside, but it's pretty loud to me. Motion detecting at front door. So glad that doesn't freak me out anymore. It just annoys me. Because it's never true. There's nobody ever there. Gosh. Okay. I'm gonna stop there for today. I'm gonna try to make these a little shorter. I don't really know what YouTube likes these videos links to be, but I can't figure it out. YouTube will show some of my ASMR videos to a lot of people, and then the others they won't. It's probably the thumbnails. I got a pretty hateful comment the other day about my thumbnails, so that's probably what it is. There are no excuses, but my mental health hasn't been great, so I'm gonna say that might be why my thumbnails haven't been great, but I've been trying my hardest, okay? Things are looking up, things are changing in my life. I'm gonna be moving soon. I wanted to focus on YouTube for a while, but turns out I should have just been focusing on myself and getting my life together before that. When you know that you should focus on being comfortable, but yet you just can't feel comfortable, maybe there's a problem with your surroundings. That's what I realized recently. I kind of knew that too, and it's like, it's a lesson I've learned in I don't listen to my gut a lot of the time. I just want to trust people and like give them the benefit of the doubt. Especially in friendships. Like when it comes to relationships, I will not deal with somebody's bullshit for too long. Like that's definitely why I've been single for so long. But I've always like really wanted to have good friends. So I end up trusting that people are good people when they say that they're my friend and they want to help me, blah blah blah. But you gotta listen to your instincts. You have to listen to your gut. Especially me. I think I might actually be psychic in ways. So the fact that I don't listen to my gut at times is so ironic. This has really taught me that my gut is always right. So yeah, just a message. Whatever. You know what's interesting? I just realized they must have been going through one of the El Niños. That rarely happens, but is happening this year, 2023. So ironic that it's in this book I'm reading, and it's happening to us this year. We have a super El Niño this year. That's why it's been so much more rainy, at least in the US. Anyway, okay. Super El Niño means much more water. I don't know how else to explain that to exposed me to a point. Oh, I'm getting goosebumps. I watched a couple of YouTubers, specifically, I can't remember. Okay, actually, Nick is not green, I remember. He made a whole video about how when he was a child, his parents were very religious, and it gave him this huge fear of death. Maybe actually it wasn't from religion, but either way, I watched a few different YouTubers, including Nick, talk about having a major fear of death and like things like that because of religion as a child, scaring the crap out of them. And I wasn't exposed to a lot of religion super young. I was to a little bit, but it's almost like I was too mature already to let anything really get into my mind. And like, I don't know, I didn't really believe much because of what I'd already gone through at such a young age, so I was just kind of not fazed by anything. But I still like went to church with some of my friends sometimes and like enjoyed it because it was a nice change of pace to the life that I had. But I can't imagine the fear that it instills in children, being like so exposed to religious stuff, especially like this poor kid thinks there's gonna be a flood. Okay. My dog is snoring, by the way, if you hear anything. That's my pony butt against this hard surface. This is my beautiful cat, Mary Jane, by the way. My roommate sadly left this morning so early, actually, to take his cats back to his ex, who decided, after they broke up, like months after, that she wanted to take the cats. So my cat is being extra happy this morning. She's never been this comfortable in this house because his cats were kind of mean, but I ended up really loving them, so I'm a little bit sad. At least we have this kooky one. I've had her since she was a week-old kitten, and I saved her. I was 16, so she's 10 now. That means, wow. But I had to bottle feed her with a little, oh my gosh, with a tiny little bottle with kitten formula. You can get kitten formula, like cans of it, at pet supply stores, basically anywhere. It was so cute. She was so tiny, she would stand on my hand with her 2 front feet, and I would hold the bottle. Oh my gosh. My angel. My first angel. My dog is my second angel. And now I have a pet frog, you guys. She's so cute. She makes me so happy. She looks like aspen trees, which I love aspen trees. Okay. I'll keep reading. Almost the end of August. This is so ironic. Because it is almost the end of August, and I haven't talked to the person that I love for over 2 weeks. God, this book just like connects with me way too much. It's scary. Okay. I am very tired right now. It's 6 in the morning. I woke up at 5 in the morning. Actually, I woke up at like 3. And then was just tossing and turning, and then I think my cat knows when I'm tossing and turning, so she starts making noise and meowing at me to like force me to wake up even more. So I do. I was up at 5 a.m. and I was like, dang, I really didn't make an ASMR video last night like I planned. And I also have been thinking of maybe doing it in the mornings before work. And because I woke up at 5 this morning, that means I have enough time to film an ASMR video, at least quickly. But I don't have all of my wardrobe yet, all of my clothing. I of course made sure to have a bunch of clean work clothes for going to work every day this week. But otherwise, I have this. And I'm kind of broke right now for the time being, and I don't even have freaking laundry detergent. I think I will this weekend though, so don't worry, it's okay. Yeah, all that to say, I'm wearing a robe. Okay, get over it. I'm sorry. Okay. read the whole book in a quick enough succession, then I'll be able to dissect it. Maybe I'll make a whole video after I finish this series, dissecting it, explaining why I love it so much, all that jazz. I also want to say I'm sorry if I haven't responded to your comment. Anybody who's commented on any of my videos, first of all, it's hard to keep track of every video's comments, and YouTube for some reason does not notify me of every comment, and I have been so mentally unwell that I feel incapable of speaking to other human beings. At least a lot of the time. There are some times when I feel better. Lately I've felt a lot better, but yeah. I've never been on a train, and I kind of realized growing up how much I really would love it. I think because when my birthday comes around, it's such a weird time. So I end up just doing stuff for myself, by myself, because nobody remembers and nobody cares. But at least that's my experience so far. I think one year I'll probably take myself on a train ride, through the mountains or something. That would be an absolute dream for me. I love nature. I made up a word for it in my head. Nature roller coaster. Even though it's not crazy like a roller coaster. It's you just get to sit there and watch. I don't know. It sounds kind of dumb trying to explain it now, but it's always made sense in my head. Nature roller coaster. Okay. Anyway. That's how my mom is when we go to stores or restaurants. It's so embarrassing. I'm like the person who would never... Well, I'm growing out of that. Now I know how to ask for help or say when I have a problem at stores or restaurants, but if it's not a big problem, I don't know, I just wouldn't make a fool of myself going up and saying, this is stale, replace it for something else. I feel like that's just so rude, and it's definitely not the worker's fault. I mean, maybe it is, but I don't know. I'm the person who would rather eat 2 bites of a stale donut than throw it away, then go up to the workers and tell them that it's stale. Okay. You don't need a brass bed to understand it. Literally rolling my eyes. I don't know what YouTube wants anymore. I don't know what anyone wants. I'm just trying to do my best. Sorry, I was a little bit melancholy in my last video. Let's move past it. Okay. That's too low, isn't it? This costume's a little too big for me, so I used tape in the back. Shh. You'll never know. It's okay. Okay. Forget you ever heard that. I'll put this in the bloopers so nobody will know unless they watch the whole video. Okay. I'm just trying to find where I left off, dang it. Of course, my fridge is gonna make weird noises. Thank you, fridge. Talcum powder is very bad, okay? Do not use talcum powder. This was figured out to be horrible for human consumption and use years ago. So if you didn't know that, now you know. And if you still use talcum powder, stop. And if your grandparents or your parents use it, tell them to stop. Show them. Look up on Google about how it's been recalled and it's been known to harm people health-wise. And send them to your parents or grandparents so that they can be safe. Okay? These things cause cancer. And my grandpa died of brain cancer in July of this year. And they didn't even figure out he had brain cancer until the same month that he died. And it's probably because they used products like that constantly. My grandma has those wick things all around her house, those air wicks that spurt out a scent, like a bunch of perfume every hour. They blow out this crap that I can't breathe when I smell it. And yeah, those were all around my grandma's house, and it wouldn't surprise me if those aided, at least, in his brain cancer, progressing. want you guys to be as safe as you can with your families, if you can. Okay. Moment my son had surpassed me in size. I imagine it's because as you, Leo, got older, you shrunk, as old people do. I am almost 27, and I am taller than my grandma and my mom, which means I'm just gonna shrink. I have nowhere to go but down from here. For leaving him alone with his father for so long. Kids don't know. You should still give them credit. They are clueless. Maybe you should have explained it to him. Gosh. So, I wanted to say, I was very scared to go and see my grandpa die. We all knew that he was dying for like a long time, but when it got closer, I started to know. And it got harder and harder for me, and I kind of made the decision that I wasn't going to go because I didn't think I could handle it. Well, something within me changed. I think it was when my sister very inappropriately took a picture of my grandpa on his deathbed, in his hospice bed, at home. Thank God he was at home. At least that was great for him. Yeah, my sister sent me a picture out of nowhere of him, and that really set it in for me. And I immediately started planning a trip to my hometown. I went to my hometown, and I was there for a day and a half, and I was in the room when he died, along with his two favorite daughters. Actually, his two favorite daughters and my grandma and me were all in the room, along with his favorite dog and his other favorite dog, who's my dog, Honey. All of his favorite women were in the room, and he passed very, very peacefully. So, yeah, if you're afraid, I would say not to be. But I have always been the one who, like, I won't judge you either way. Like, if you don't think you can handle it, if you think it would just be bad for you to see your loved one in that state before death, then don't do it. It's good to have good memories of them. And my family is so broken that I couldn't necessarily even have any good time with my grandpa before he died, so this was kind of the best scenario. Plus, my life has been such a mess this year, so I'm just happy I made it at all. And I think me making it there allowed him to die peacefully. I think he was seriously hanging on until I got there. And even until I held his hand and told him that I was going to be okay if he died. Because then he died an hour after that. Or a couple hours. But yeah. I haven't really shared that on my channel. Or with, like, anybody. On a rainy day that gave... Baby! Did you hear my cat meowing? Gosh, I'm almost done with this chapter. Uh-oh. The tape is coming undone again. No, I'm almost done. Okay. I just can't move, apparently. Great, okay. Yeah, I hope you guys are doing well. Happy spooky time. If you don't feel loved right now, know that you are deserving of them. And one day you will have it. I'm putting that into the universe. We will all have the love we will deserve. Whatever you're doing, have a good day, good night, good evening. Bye, guys.